Picture a grand English manor, where a wealthy widow sips her afternoon tea unaware. It's laced with deadly cyanide. In the poisoned tea, Miss Jane Marple unravels a web of betrayal among 4 suspects. A charming nephew craving her fortune, a desperate cook drowning in debt, a loyal gardener hiding a grudge, and a glamorous friend masking financial ruin. As clues emerge, a tampered tea caddy, a hidden vial, a forged note. Marple's sharp mind exposes the killer, a trusted confidant who turned friendship into poison. Dive into this classic whodunit, where trust is fatal and secrets brew in every cup. Chapter 1. The invitation to Thornfield Manor. The late August sun dipped low over St. Mary Mead, bathing the village in a honeyed glow. In her cottage, where roses climbed the walls and lavender scented the air, Miss Jane Marple sat by the window, her knitting needles clicking with the steady rhythm of a metronome. The afternoon was quiet, save for the distant hum of bees and the occasional chirp of a sparrow. On the table beside her, a cup of Darjeeling cooled, its steam curling like a question mark. She paused, her fingers hovering over the soft wall. As the postman's bicycle crunched up the gravel path, the letter he delivered was unexpected. Its cream envelope thick and embossed with the crest of Thornfield Manor, Miss Marple slit it. Open with a silver letter knife, her movements precise. The handwriting was elegant, unmistakably that of Mrs. Evelyn Harrow, a widow of considerable wealth and a distant acquaintance from years past. The note invited Miss Marple to afternoon tea at Thornfield Manor the following day, describing it as a small gathering of dear friends and family to brighten the summer's end. The tone was polite, even warm, yet Miss Marple's pale blue eyes lingered on the words. Something in the formality, the careful choice of phrase, struck her as unlike Evelyn's usual breezy correspondence. She folded the letter and tucked it into her sewing basket, her mind already turning over possibilities. Invitations, she knew, often carried more than they seemed. The next day, Miss Marple dressed with her usual care, a black silk dress softened by a lavender shawl and a brooch pinned at her throat. Her straw hat, adorned with a single ribbon, sat neatly on her white hair. The journey to Thornfield Manor was a short one, the taxi winding through lanes hedged with blackberry bushes and fields dotted with grazing sheep. The manor itself rose into view like a painting, its Georgian facade cloaked in ivy, its tall windows catching the sunlight. A peacock strutted across the lawn, its tail feathers shimmering. Miss Marple stepped out, her bird-like frame deceptively frail, and felt the weight of the house's grandeur. It was beautiful, but its stillness suggested secrets. Evelyn Harrow greeted her in the drawing-room, a vast space of polished oak and damask curtains. The widow, in her late 60s, wore a gown of dove-grey silk, her silver hair swept into an elegant chignon. Her smile was welcoming, but Miss Marple noted a tightness around her eyes, a faint tremor in her hand as she gestured to a velvet settee. "Jane, how kind of you to come," Evelyn said, her voice rich but edged with strain. "It's been too long." Miss Marple murmured agreement, settling herself with her knitting bag at her side. Her eyes, sharp behind their mild expression, took in the room's other occupants. Leonard Harrow, Evelyn's nephew, leaned against the mantelpiece, his dark hair slicked back and his suit impeccably tailored. He was handsome, with a quick smile, but his fingers drummed restlessly on the marble, and his gaze flickered toward his aunt with a mix of charm and calculation. Mrs. Clara Bates, the cook, stood near the tea trolley, her broad frame encased in a starched apron. Her face was flushed, her eyes darting as she adjusted a plate of biscuits with unnecessary care. Tom Rigby, the gardener, hovered by the French doors, his boots scrubbed but his hands betraying the soil of his trade. His weathered features were set, his silence almost sullen. Lastly, Mrs. Beatrice Lyle, Evelyn's closest friend, swept in with a laugh, her emerald dress vibrant against the room's muted tones. Her chatter was bright, but Miss Marple caught a brittleness in it, as if the gaiety were a performance. Tea was to be served in the conservatory, Evelyn announced, leading the way. Miss Marple followed, her steps slow but deliberate, her senses attuned to the undercurrents. Leonard offered his arm, his gallantry polished, but his eyes elsewhere. Clara muttered about the tea leaves being just so, her voice low. Tom trailed behind, his gaze fixed on the floor. Beatrice's laughter echoed, but it faltered when Evelyn glanced back. As they entered the conservatory, a glass-walled haven of ferns and orchids, Miss Marple's needles resumed their soft click. She smiled gently, her thoughts as intricate as her stitches. Thornfield Manor was a stage, its players assembled, and she sensed the curtain was about to rise on something far darker than tea. Chapter 2. The fatal Teether Conservatory at Thornfield Manor was a marvel of glass and greenery, its panes catching the late afternoon sun and casting dappled shadows across the flagstone floor. Exotic ferns arched over rottion benches, and a trellis of jasmine perfumed the air with a sweetness that bordered on cloying. At the centre stood a round mahogany table, draped in crisp linen and set with a tea service that gleamed like moonlight, a silver teapot, delicate porcelain cups, and a tiered stand laden with scones, cucumber sandwiches, and petits fours. Miss Jane Marple, seated near a potted palm, adjusted her lavender shawl and let her pale blue eyes roam the scene. Her knitting lay idle in her lap, a rare pause, for her attention was wholly absorbed by the gathering before her. Mrs. Evelyn Harrow presided over the table with the grace of long practice, her grey silk gown whispering as she lifted the teapot. Her movements were steady, yet Miss Marple noted a faint quiver in her fingers, a hesitancy that belied her composed smile. Evelyn's silver hair glinted under the conservatory's glass roof, but her face, though still handsome, bore the weight of some unspoken strain. Around her sat the small party, Leonard Harrow, her nephew, lounging with a studied ease that did not quite mask his restless glances. Mrs. Clara Bates, the cook, stiff in her chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Tom Rigby, the gardener, perched awkwardly, his weathered hands ill at ease with the fragile teacup before him. And Mrs. Beatrice Lyle, Evelyn's friend, whose animated chatter filled the air like the trill of a caged bird. Miss Marple, unobtrusive in her corner, sipped her tea Darjeeling with a bitter undertone she found curious and let the conversation wash over her mind sifting every word and gesture. Leonard was speaking, his voice smooth as polished. "Oak, London's the place for opportunity, Aunt Evelyn," he said, leaning forward, his dark eyes bright with enthusiasm. "The docks are buzzing with new venture shipping, trade, you name it. A man with capital could make a fortune." He flashed a smile, but Miss Marple caught the edge in it, the hint of a plea. Evelyn's lips curved, but her reply was measured. "Capital requires caution, Leonard. Fortunes are as easily lost as won." Her tone was gentle, yet there was a firmness that made Leonard's smile falter. He leaned back, his fingers tapping the arm of his chair, and Miss Marple noted the quick glance he shot toward the teapot, as if it held answers his aunt withheld. Beatrice Lyle broke the moment with a laugh, her emerald dress catching the light, as she gestured with her teacup. "Oh, Evelyn, you're too practical. Leonard's right life's for living. Why, in Paris last spring, I saw the most divine fashions, all bold colours and daring cuts. We're so dreadfully behind here. Her voice was bright, but Miss Marple observed the way Beatrice's eyes darted to Evelyn, seeking approval or perhaps something else. Evelyn's smile tightened. Paris is charming, Beatrice, but Thornfield has its own allure. The words were polite, yet Miss Marple sensed a coolness, a subtle rebuff. Beatrice's laugh rang again, a touch too loud, and she reached for a scone. Crumbling it absent-lie, Clara Bates, silent until now, cleared her throat. "The scones are rosemary, ma'am," she said to Evelyn, her voice low and clipped. "From the herb garden, like you asked." Her broad face was flushed, her eyes fixed on the tablecloth as if it held secrets. Evelyn nodded, her expression softening. "You've outdone yourself, Clara. The tea too, it's my private blend, isn't it?" Clara gave a curt nod, her hands twisting in her lap. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the cook. Clara's discomfort was palpable, her usual bustling, confidence replaced by a wariness that seemed out of place in her own domain. The tea, Miss Marple thought, was indeed distinctive. Its bitterness lingered on her tongue, masked only by the sugar she'd stirred in. Tom Rigby, the gardener, shifted in his seat, his calloused fingers dwarfing the teacup he held. "Them orchids by the window," he said abruptly, his voice gruff. "They're blooming early this year. Took a lot of care, they did." His eyes, a faded green, met Evelyn's briefly before dropping to his plate. Evelyn's face lit with genuine warmth. "You've worked wonders, Tom. The conservatory owes its beauty to you." Tom grunted, a faint flush creeping up his neck, and Miss Marple noted the pride in his posture, tempered by a shadow of unease. His hands, she saw, were not quite steady as he set down his cup. The conversation drifted, a delicate dance of pleasantries and half-truths. Miss Marple listened, her needles still, her mind cataloguing every nuance. Leonard's ambition, Beatrice's forced gaiety, Clara's tension. Tom's reticent siege was a thread in a tapestry she could not yet fully discern. Evelyn, at the centre, seemed both anchor and enigma, her graciousness a veneer over something unspoken. Miss Marple's eyes strayed to the teapot, its silver surface reflecting the room's muted light. Evelyn poured another round, her movements slower now, and Miss Marple caught a fleeting grimace as the widow lifted her own cup. The bitter taste in her own tea lingered, and a faint prickle of suspicion stirred in her mind. It was then that the air shifted. Evelyn set down her teacup with a soft clink, her hand rising to her throat. A gasp escaped her, sharp and ragged, and her face drained of colour, her eyes wide with sudden terror. The teacup slipped from her fingers, shattering on the flagstones, with a sound like breaking ice. "Evelyn," Beatrice cried, her voice piercing the stunned silence. Evelyn's body convulsed, her breath coming in shallow, desperate wheezes. She clutched at the table, knocking over a saucer, and then collapsed, her grey silk gown pooling around her like spilled ink. Leonard froze, his face ashen. Clara's hands flew to her mouth, stifling a cry. Tom lurched forward, kneeling beside Evelyn, his rough hands hovering uselessly over her still form. Beatrice's screams echoed off the glass walls, a discordant counterpoint to the conservatory's serene beauty. Miss Marple's heart thudded, but her mind was a calm, clear pool. She rose, her movements deliberate, and stepped to Evelyn's side. The widow's eyes were open, staring blankly at the glass ceiling, her lips tinged with a faint blue. Her chest was still, her breath gone. Miss Marple's gaze swept the table, scattered teacups, the overturned saucer, the teapot glinting innocently. She reached for her own teacup, its contents barely touched, and slipped her napkin over it, tucking it behind a fern with a gesture so subtle no one noticed. The bitter taste, the sudden collapse her mind whispered a single word: poison. Beatrice's screams had subsided into sobs, her hands clutching Leonard's arm. "Do something," she pleaded, her voice trembling. Leonard, pale and shaken, shook his head. His earlier charm dissolved into helplessness. She's gone," he stammered, his eyes darting to the shattered teacup at Evelyn's feet. Clara stood rooted, her face a mask of horror, her hands still pressed to her mouth. Tom, still kneeling, looked up, his expression a mix of grief and confusion. "It was so quick," he muttered, almost to himself. Miss Marple's eyes met his briefly, noting the way his hands clenched, the dirt under his nails stark against his pale knuckles. The conservatory door burst open, and the housekeeper, Mrs. Gibbs, rushed in, her apron askew. "What's happened?" she gasped, her eyes widening at the scene. Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice soft but firm. "Mrs. Harrow has been taken ill, gravely so. We must send for a doctor and the police at once." Mrs. Gibbs nodded, her face blanching, and hurried out, her footsteps echoing in the hall. Miss Marple returned to her chair, her hands folding over her knitting, but her eyes never left the table. The teapot, the cups, the scattered remnants of the teeth, they were the stage of a tragedy, and she was determined to read its script. The minutes stretched, heavy with shock and silence. Beatrice sank into a chair, her sobs muffled by a handkerchief. Leonard paced, his hands thrust into his pockets, his jaw tight. Clara, still standing, seemed to shrink into herself, her eyes fixed on the floor. Tom rose slowly, his movements stiff, and retreated to the edge of the room, his gaze distant. Miss Marple watched them all, her mind turning over the moments before Evelyn's collapse. The bitter tea, the tremor in Evelyn's hand, the glances exchanged around the table each, was a clue, small but significant. She recalled Evelyn's strained smile, her distracted air. Had she sensed danger? Had she known her tea was tainted? The distant wail of a siren broke the stillness, signaling the arrival of help. Miss Marple's thoughts sharpened. Cyanide, she suspected, given the speed of Evelyn's collapse and the faint almond-like scent she detected near the shattered teacup. It was a poison that required precision and opportunity, and its presence in the tea suggested a calculated act. Who among this small circle had the means and motive to wield it? Leonard, with his ambitions and restless hands. Beatrice, whose gaiety seemed a mask. Clara, whose tension bespoke more than culinary concerns. Or Tom, whose quiet intensity hid depths she could not yet fathom. As the police and Dr. Haydock, the local physician, entered the conservatory, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, the soft click of her needles a counterpoint to the chaos. Inspector Craddock, a brisk man with sharp eyes and a clipped mustache, took charge, his questions cutting through the group's stunned silence. Dr. Haydock knelt beside Evelyn, his examination brief but thorough. "Cyanide," he confirmed, his voice low, his glance at Craddock heavy with meaning. The inspector's gaze swept the room, lingering on the teapot and the scattered cups. "No one leaves," he said curtly. "This is a crime scene." Miss Marple's needles paused as she met Craddock's eyes. He knew her reputation, she could tell, and his nod was grudging but respectful. She said nothing, her expression mild, but her mind was a whirlwind of connections. The tea had been poured from a single pot, yet only Evelyn had succumbed. Was the poison in the pot, or had her cup been tampered with? The napkin-covered teacup behind the fern would tell, she hoped. For now, she watched and listened, her frail frame a disguise for the relentless curiosity that had unraveled many a mystery. The suspects were ushered to the drawing-room, their faces a gallery of shock, fear, and suspicion. Miss Marple followed, her steps slow but purposeful. The conservatory, with its shattered teacup and silent orchids, held the truth, and she would find it. Evelyn Harrow's death was no accident, and the bitter tea was only the beginning. As she settled into a corner of the drawing-room, her knitting resumed, and her eyes, bright and unyielding, began to trace the threads of a murder. Chapter 3. The Inspector's Arrival at the Conservatory at Thornfield Manor. So recently a haven of jasmine and sunlight had transformed into a sombre stage, its glass walls reflecting the flickering lanterns of the county police, the air heavy with the scent of crushed ferns and spilt tea, carried a new sharpness and acrid trace that Miss Jane Marple recognized as the lingering ghost of cyanide. Evelyn Harrow's body lay covered by a white sheet, her grey silk gown a faint outline. Beneath, while the shattered remnants of her teacup glittered on the flagstones like scattered stars, Miss Marple sat quietly on a Rottian bench, her lavender shawl draped over her shoulders, her knitting needles clicking softly in a rhythm that belied the keen intensity of her thoughts, her own teacup discreetly hidden beneath a napkin, behind a potted palm, remained untouched by the bustling officers. She had preserved it, sensing its contents held a key to the tragedy unfolding before her. The arrival of Inspector Craddock brought a brisk efficiency to the scene. A man in his 40s, with a clipped moustache and eyes that missed little, he strode into the conservatory with the air of one accustomed to command. His navy suit was immaculate, his movements precise as he surveyed the room, the mahogany table strewn with untouched scones, the silver teapot gleaming under the lantern light. The guests now huddled in a corner, their faces etched with shock and suspicion. Dr. Haydock, the local physician, a stout man with a kindly but grave demeanor, stood beside Evelyn's body, his examination complete. He caught Craddock's eye and gave a slight nod. "Cyanide, poisoning," he said, his voice low but clear. Death was near instantaneous. The symptoms convulsions, cyanosis are unmistakable. Craddock's jaw tightened, and he glanced at the teapot, his mind already tracing the poisons. Miss Marple watched the inspector closely, noting the way his gaze lingered on each suspect. Leonard Harrow stood by the French doors, his handsome face pale, his hands thrust deep into his pockets as if to still their trembling. Mrs. Clara Bates, the cook, sat heavily on a bench, her broad frame slumped, her eyes fixed on her clasped hands with a desperation that seemed to ward off the world. Tom Rigby, the gardener, leaned against a glass pane, his weathered features set in a mask of stoic grief, though his fingers twitched at his sides. Mrs. Beatrice Lyle, Evelyn's friend, paced near the table, her emerald dress a jarring note of vibrancy in the sombre scene. Her earlier hysterics had given way to a restless energy, her eyes darting between the inspector and the covered body. Miss Marple's needles clicked, a soft counterpoint to the murmurs of the police, as she catalogued their postures, their silences, their fleeting glances. Craddock turned to the group, his voice sharp. "This room is a crime scene. No one is to touch anything until we've completed our examination. You'll be questioned in the library shortly." He gestured to a young constable, who began cordoning off the table with tape. The suspects were ushered out, their footsteps echoing on the flagstones, and Miss Marple followed, her frail frame moving with deceptive slowness. She paused at the conservatory door, casting a final glance at the teapot and her hidden teacup. The tea, she was certain, was the poison's vehicle, but whether it was in the pot or Evelyn's cup alone remained a puzzle. Her mind, sharp as the needle in her hand, began to weave the threads of what she had seen and heard. The library was a grand room, its walls lined with leather-bound volumes and portraits of Harrow ancestors, their stern gazes seeming to judge the living. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow over the heavy oak furniture, but the atmosphere was chill with tension. The suspects were seated in a semicircle, their chairs arranged by a quick-handed maid under Craddock's orders. Miss Marple chose a backed chair in a shadowed corner, her knitting resumed, her presence so unobtrusive that she seemed part of the furniture. Yet her eyes, bright and unyielding, missed nothing. Leonard's nervous cough, Clara's rigid stillness, Tom's clenched jaw, Beatrice's fidgeting with a silk handkerchief. Craddock stood before them, his notebook open, his pencil poised. Mrs. Evelyn Harrow was murdered, he began, his tone matter-of-fact but weighted with authority. Cyanide is a swift and deliberate poison, requiring access and intent. I need to know your movements, your conversations, and anything you noticed before her death. His gaze swept the group, lingering on each face as if to peel back their defenses. Miss Marple noted the way Leonard shifted in his seat, his charm replaced by a wary caution. Clara's hands tightened until her knuckles whitened. Tom's eyes narrowed, as if bracing for an attack, and Beatrice's lips parted, then closed, her usual volubility stilled. Leonard was questioned first. He rose, smoothing his dark hair, his voice striving for composure. "I was with Aunt Evelyn most of the afternoon," he said. "We talked in the drawing room before tea about my plans, business ventures." She was skeptical, but we parted on good terms. In the conservatory, I sat across from her, just chatting about London. He hesitated, his eyes flicking to the inspector. I didn't see anything odd. She seemed fine until she wasn't. Craddock's pencil scratched. And the tea, did you handle it? Leonard shook his head. No, Aunt Evelyn poured. I took my cup from her. Miss Marple. Needles paused. Leonard's account was smooth, but his hesitation, his quick glance at the floor, suggested something unsaid. She recalled his restless hands during tea, his veiled plea for Evelyn's support. Ambition, she knew, could curdle into darker motives. Clara Bates was next, her voice barely above a whisper. I made the tea, sir, like always. Mrs. Harrow. Special blend, kept in a locked caddy in the kitchen. I brewed it fresh, brought the pot to the conservatory myself. Nothing was different. Her eyes, red-rimmed, met Craddock's briefly before dropping. I was in my seat when it happened. I didn't touch her cup. Craddock leaned forward. The caddy, was it secure? Could anyone have tampered with the leaves? Clara's flush deepened. It was locked, sir. I've the only key, and I never let it out of my sight. Miss Marple's lips pursed. Clara's defensiveness was natural, yet her insistence on the key felt too emphatic, as if shielding a vulnerability. The cook's access to the tea was undeniable, but her fear seemed to outstrip her role as a mere servant. Tom Rigby spoke with reluctance, his gruff voice halting. I was in the shed, polishing my tools, till just before tea, Mrs. Harrow asked me to join. said it'd be a treat. I sat at the table, drank what was given me. Didn't see nothing wrong till she fell. His hands, resting on his knees, were steady now, but Miss Marple noted a faint tremor earlier, a sign of nerves or grief. Craddock pressed him. You work with chemicals, Mr. Rigby, fertilizers, pesticide, anything like cyanide. Tom's eyes flashed. I've got chemicals, aye, but they're locked up tight. Nobody gets in my shed without me knowing. His tone was defiant, but Miss Marple caught a flicker of unease, a shadow that suggested his shed was not as inviolable as he claimed. Beatrice Lyle was last, her voice trembling but her words carefully chosen. Evelyn and I were close as sisters, she said, her silk handkerchief twisting in her hands. We had a silly tiff last week about a charity ball, nothing serious, but today was all warmth. I was beside her at tea, talking of Paris, when oh, it was dreadful. Tears welled, but Miss Marple observed their timing. The way Beatrice's eyes darted to the others, as if gauging their reactions. Craddock's tone was gentle but probing. Did you handle the tea, Mrs. Lyle? Beatrice shook her head vigorously. No, Evelyn poured for us all. I took my cup, and that was that. Miss Marple's needles clicked. Beatrice's tears were convincing, but her quick denial, her overplayed grief, hinted at a performance. A woman of her poise, Miss Marple thought, could hide much behind a handkerchief. Craddock closed his notebook, his expression unreadable. You'll remain here until we've searched the premises. Constable, escort them to the drawing room, and ensure they stay put. The suspects filed out, their silence heavy with unspoken accusations. Miss Marple lingered, catching Craddock's eye. Inspector, she said softly, might I suggest testing the teapot's contents? And perhaps, she hesitated, her tone deferential. I left my teacup in the conservatory, behind the palm. It may be of interest. Craddock's eyebrows rose, but he nodded, a glint of respect in his gaze. You've a sharp eye, Miss Marple, we'll see to it. Alone in the library, Miss Marple settled back, her knitting a soft rhythm in the firelight. The suspects' stories were plausible, yet each carried a flaw, a crack in the facade. Leonard's ambition, Clara's access, Tom's chemicals, Beatrice's. Theatrix each was a piece of a larger puzzle. She recalled Evelyn's demeanor at tea, the tremor in her hand, the distracted glance toward the door, the bitter taste of the Darjeeling. Had Evelyn suspected danger? The locked caddy, Clara had said, was secure, but locks could be picked, keys borrowed. Cyanide, swift and odorless until it killed, required knowledge and opportunity. Who among them had both? Her thoughts turned to the manor itself, its grandeur a cloak for secrets. Evelyn, a widow of wealth and influence, had wielded power over her circle. Leonard's business ventures, Beatrice's debts, Clara's servitude, Tom's devotion to the estate each tied. Them to her, each offered a motive. Miss Marple's mind drifted to her village, St. Mary Mead, where human nature played out in simpler settings. A jilted lover, a greedy heir, a resentful servant, their passions were the same, whether in a cottage or a manor. Here, the stakes were higher, the stage grander, but the heart of the crime was familiar. The library door opened, and Dr. Haydock entered, his face weary. A bad business, Miss Marple, he said, sinking into a chair. Cyanide's not a common poison, it's deliberate, cold. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes gentle but probing. You've seen such cases before, Doctor. Haydock sighed. Once, years ago, a chemist's assistant, driven to despair. The stuff's not hard to get if you know where to look. Gardening supplies, industrial stores. Miss Marple's needles paused. Gardening supplies? Tom's shed, with its locked chemicals, loomed in her mind. Yet Clara's kitchen, be it cunning, Leonard's desperation, each could lead to the same end. As the fire crackled, Miss Marple's thoughts sharpened. The teacup she had preserved would confirm whether the poison was in the pot or Evelyn's cup alone. If the former, Clara's role was central. If the latter, the killer had been precise, perhaps waiting for Evelyn to pour. She recalled the conservatory's layout, the table's proximity to the French doors, the ferns offering cover, the teapot within reach of all. Opportunity was shared, but motive was singular. Evelyn's death, she sensed, was not a crime of impulse but of calculation, its roots buried in the manor's shadowed corners. Craddock returned, his expression grim. The teapots being tested, Miss Marple, and your teacups with the lab. We found nothing else, yet no vials, no powders. He hesitated, then added, "You've a knack for this. Anything strike you?" Miss Marple's smile was mild, her voice soft. "Only that people are rarely what they seem, Inspector. Mrs. Harrow's circle is small, but their secrets are not." Craddock nodded, his respect deepening. "We'll dig deeper. For now, keep your eyes open." He left, and Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her mind a tapestry of clues and suspicions. The library's clock chimed, marking the slow passage of the evening. Outside, the manor's gardens lay dark, their beauty masking whatever truths they held. Miss Marple's needles clicked, each stitch a step toward unraveling the murder of Evelyn Harrow. The tea, the cyanide, the shattered teacup, they were signposts, and she would follow them through the lies and silences to the heart of the crime. Chapter 4. The widow's secrets. The morning after Evelyn Harrow's death dawned grey and heavy. The sky over Thornfield Manor cloaked in clouds that pressed low against the ivy-clad towers. Inside, the air was thick with the residue of tragedy. The grandeur of polished oak and crystal chandeliers dimmed by an unspoken dread. Miss Jane Marple sat in the morning room, a quiet space of chintz curtains and faded watercolours, her knitting needles moving with their usual precision. Her lavender shawl was draped over her shoulders, and her eyes, bright and unyielding behind their mild expression, roamed the room, though her thoughts were elsewhere. The events of the previous day, the bitter tea, Evelyn's sudden collapse. The acrid whisper of cyanide had set her mind in motion, and she was determined to unravel the threads of this calculated crime. The manor was subdued, its staff moving with hushed steps as Inspector Craddock's men continued their search. The conservatory remained sealed, its glass walls a silent witness to the fatal tea. Miss Marple had risen early, her sleep light but sufficient, and had taken her breakfast alone, declining the heavy trays of kedgeree and toast in favour of a simple cup of Earl Grey. The tea, she noted with a faint grimace, lacked the curious bitterness of the Darjeeling served yesterday. Her own teacup, preserved behind the conservatory's palm, was now in the hands of the police, and she awaited its analysis with a patience born of experience. For now, she turned her attention to the manor itself, sensing that Evelyn's life, habits, her relationships, her secrets held the key to her death. Miss Marple's first destination was Evelyn's study, a room she had glimpsed during her arrival but not yet explored. She moved through the manor's corridors with the unobtrusive grace of a shadow, her frail appearance disarming the maids who scurried past with dusters and trays. The study was on the ground floor, its tall windows overlooking the rose garden, where petals lay scattered by an overnight wind. The door was ajar, and Miss Marple slipped inside, her steps muffled by a Persian rug. The room was a testament to Evelyn's wealth and taste. A mahogany desk gleamed under a brass lamp, bookshelves held volumes of history and poetry, and a portrait of a stern-faced Harrow ancestor glowered from above the fireplace. Yet there was a faint disorder, a drawer, half open, a pen left uncapped that suggested Evelyn's recent unease. Miss Marple's eyes settled on the desk, where a locked drawer caught her attention. Its brass keyhole was scratched, as if someone had fumbled with it. She glanced toward the door, ensuring she was alone, then approached the housekeeper, Mrs. Gibbs, whom she found in the hall polishing a silver candelabra. "Mrs. Gibbs," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but firm, "I wonder if you might assist me. Mrs. Harrow's study there's a drawer I'd like to examine. For the inspector's sake, of course." Mrs. Gibbs, a wiry woman with a perpetually harried air, hesitated, her cloth pausing mid-swipe. Miss Marple's smile was disarming, her tone suggesting only the mild curiosity of an elderly guest. And Mrs. Gibbs relented, fetching a ring of keys from her apron. The drawer yielded to the housekeeper's key, revealing a trove of papers, letters, receipts, and a leather-bound ledger. Miss Marple's fingers, delicate but sure, sifted through them, her eyes scanning with the precision of a scholar. The ledger was the prizer, meticulous record of Evelyn's financial dealings, its pages filled with her elegant script. Among the entries were loans to local figures, a modest sum to the village vicar for church repairs, a larger one to a farmer for new equipment. But one entry stood out, a loan of £5,000 to Clara Bates, dated 2 years prior, marked unpaid in red ink. Beside it were notes of Clara's requests for extensions, each met with Evelyn's increasingly curt refusals. The final entry, dated a week ago, read, "Clara must settle or face consequences." Miss Marple's lips pursed. Debt was a powerful motive, and Clara's role in preparing the tea made her a natural suspect. Yet the very obviousness of it gave Miss Marple pause. Murder, she knew, was rarely so straightforward. Mrs. Gibbs, hovering nervously, offered a tidbit unprompted. Mrs. Harrow was particular about her papers. Lately she'd been locking everything: her study, her tea caddy, even her postbox. Said she didn't trust everyone here. Miss Marple nodded, her expression thoughtful. Did she mention anyone in particular? Mrs. Gibbs shook her head, her eyes darting to the door. Not by name, Miss. But she was on edge, checking things twice, like she expected trouble. Miss Marple thanked her, filing the information away. Evelyn's caution suggested she sensed a threat, perhaps from someone close. The locked caddy, the bitter teach, was a piece of a puzzle she was only beginning to assemble. Leaving the study, Miss Marple wandered the manor's halls, her steps slow but purposeful. She passed the drawing room, where Leonard Harrow sat alone, his dark hair dishevelled, a glass of brandy untouched on the table. His eyes met hers briefly, and she noted the strain in them, the way his fingers drummed a restless rhythm. She offered a gentle smile and moved on, her mind turning to his ambitions. Evelyn's will, she had learned from a discreet chat with the butler, favoured Leonard as her primary heir, but only under conditions of a natural death. A murder could tie up the estate in legal knots, delaying or denying his inheritance. Was Leonard desperate enough to risk it? His smooth account to Craddock had been plausible, but Miss Marple sensed a calculation beneath his charm. a man accustomed to bending truth to his needs. Her next stop was the library, where she found Beatrice Lyle leafing through a fashion magazine. Her emerald dress exchanged for a more subdued navy frock. Beatrice's greeting was warm, her smile bright, but Miss Marple caught the flicker of unease in her eyes. "Such a dreadful day, Miss Marple," Beatrice sighed, setting the magazine aside. "Poor Evelyn, I can't believe she's gone." Her voice trembled, but Miss Marple noted the careful modulation, the way Beatrice's hands smoothed her skirt as if to steady herself. "You were close, I understand," Miss Marple said, her tone inviting confidence. Beatrice nodded, her eyes misting. Like sisters, though lately she was distant, always fussing over her tea, her letters. "I told her she was being silly, but she wouldn't listen." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. Beatrice's grief seemed genuine, yet her words echoed Mrs. Gibbs's Evelyn's growing paranoia. Her locked caddy. Was Beatrice deflecting, or had Evelyn's fears been real? A chance remark from Beatrice deepened the mystery. "She lent me money once, for a little boutique in London. It didn't work out, and she was cross, but we sorted it." Beatrice's laugh was light, but Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. A failed venture, a debt unpaid, another motive, less glaring than Clara's, but no less potent. Beatrice's alibi, her claim of chatting at the table, was unverified, and her poise, Miss Marple thought, could mask a cunning mind. She thanked Beatrice and moved on, her thoughts circling the web of debts and dependencies that bound Evelyn's circle. The manor's grounds beckoned next, and Miss Marple ventured outside, her straw hat shielding her from a drizzle that had begun to fall. The rose garden was Tom Rigby's domain, its blooms vibrant despite the gloom. She found him near a trellis, pruning with a care that bordered on reverence. His weathered face softened at her approach, and she complimented his roses, easing his guard. "Mrs. Harrow loved these gardens," Miss Marple said, her voice warm. Tom nodded, his eyes distant. "She did. But she was planning to sell off the east field, where my greenhouse stands. Said it'd fetch a good price for developers." His voice was low, but Miss Marple caught the bitterness in it, the quiet anger of a man whose life's work was threatened. She recalled Dr. Haydock's mention of cyanide in gardening supplies. Tom's shed, she suspected, held more than pruning shears. Their conversation was brief, Tom's reticence a wall she could not yet breach. As she returned to the manor, her mind churned. Evelyn's secrets, her loans, her caution, her plans to sell had created a nexus of motives. Clara's debt was the most obvious, but Leonard's inheritance, Beatrice's financial strain, and Tom's grudge were equally compelling. The cyanide, swift and precise, required access to the tea, and Clara's kitchen was the likely stage. Yet Evelyn's locked caddy, her distrust, suggested a broader conspiracy, a betrayal by someone she knew well. Back in the morning room, Miss Marple settled with her knitting, her thoughts as intricate as the pattern in her hands. She recalled the study's ledger, its stark entries painting a picture of Evelyn's control over her circle. The locked drawer, the scratched keyhole, had someone else sort its contents. The housekeeper's words echoed, Evelyn's locked postbox, her double. Miss Marple's mind drifted to St. Mary Mead, where a village postmistress had once hidden a theft behind a locked box. Here, the stakes were higher, the players more sophisticated, but the human frailties, greed, fear, resentment were the same. A knock interrupted her reverie, and Inspector Craddock entered, his face grim but respectful. "Miss Marple, a word." He closed the door, his notebook tucked under his arm. "The teacup, you saved it with the lab, but early tests. On the teapot showed traces of cyanide. Not enough to kill the whole party, but enough for 1 cup, perhaps. Miss Marple nodded, her expression unchanged but her mind racing. The poison was in the pot, then not Evelyn's cup alone. This shifted suspicion to Clara, who brewed the tea, but Miss Marple cautioned herself against haste. And the caddy? She asked. Craddock frowned. Locked, as Mrs. Bates said. We're checking for tampering, but it's a sturdy thing. Miss Marple's smile was faint. Sturdy locks, Inspector, are only as strong as the hands that hold the key. Craddock's eyes narrowed, but he nodded. You've a way of seeing things, Miss Marple. Anything else strike you? She hesitated, her voice soft. Only that Mrs. Harrow was a woman of influence, and influence breeds envy. Her papers, her ledger, perhaps might tell you more than her tea. Craddock jotted a note, his respect evident. We'll look into it. For now, keep your eyes open. He left, and Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her needles a steady rhythm against the morning's quiet. The manor's clock chimed, marking the slow march of the investigation. Outside, the drizzle had thickened to rain, cloaking the gardens in mist. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the suspects, their motives interwoven like the strands of her wool. Clara's debt, Leonard's ambition, Beatrice's debts, Tom's. Loss each was a thread, but the pattern was incomplete. Evelyn's secrets, locked in her study and her caddy, were the key, and Miss Marple was determined to find it. The widow's death was a carefully staged act, and she would uncover the hand that had written its script. Chapter 5. The kitchen's clues. The second day at Thornfield Manor broke with a pale, reluctant dawn, the clouds parting to cast a watery light over the estate's sprawling lawns. Inside, the air was heavy with the weight of suspicion, the manners, elegance marred by the invisible stain of murder. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the morning room with a cup of weak tea, felt the pulse of the investigation quickening. Her lavender shawl was draped neatly over her shoulders, and her knitting needles moved with their familiar, unhurried rhythm, but her mind was a whirl of sharp-edged thoughts. The cyanide that had felled Evelyn Harrow, the bitter tea, the locked Cadiole pointed to a crime of precision, and Miss Marple was determined to trace its origins. Her instincts, honed by years of observing the quiet scenes of St. Mary Mead, led her to the heart of the manor's daily life, the kitchen where Clara Bates reigned and where, she suspected, the poison had found its way into the fatal brew. The kitchen was a cavernous space, its flagstone floor scrubbed to a dull sheen, its walls lined with copper pots that glinted in the morning light. A vast oak table dominated the centre, strewn with the detritus of breakfast preparations, bowls, a basket of eggs, a sprig of parsley wilting beside a cleaver. The air was thick with the scents of yeast and herbs, underscored by the faint tank of vinegar from a jar of pickles. Clara Bates stood at the stove, stirring a pot of porridge with a wooden spoon, her broad frame tense, her face set in a mask of weary defiance. Miss Marple entered quietly, her frail figure almost lost in the room's bustle, but her presence drew Clara's eye. The cook's hands tightened on the spoon, and her lips pressed into a thin line, as if bracing for an accusation. "Good morning, Mrs. Bates," Miss Marple said, her voice soft and warm, as if she were merely a guest admiring the manor's culinary prowess. "Your rosemary scones yesterday were quite delightful. A family recipe, I presume?" Clara's shoulders eased slightly, though her eyes remained wary. "My mother's, miss," she said gruffly. "She taught me to bake before I could read." Miss Marple nodded, her smile encouraging, and moved closer to the table, her fingers brushing a rolling pin as if by chance. Such skill is a treasure. And the tea Mrs. Harrow's special blend, you said. It must take great care to prepare it just as she liked. Clara's flush deepened, and she turned back to the porridge, her movements jerky. Miss. She was particular. Only her caddy, only her way. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp behind their mild expression, roamed the kitchen. On a high shelf above the sink stood the tea caddy, a lacquered box with a brass lock that gleamed faintly. Its placement was deliberate, out of reach of casual hands, and Clara's claim of sole access to its key rang in Miss Marple's mind. Beside the caddy, a row of jars held spices and dried herbs, their labels faded but legible. Her gaze settled on a mortar and pestle tucked behind a sack of flour, its stone bowl dusted with a fine white powder. Sugar, I suppose, Miss Marple said, gesturing to the mortar with a casual air. Clara's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing. Sugar, for the scones. Her voice was too quick, too firm, and Miss Marple's lips pursed. Sugar, she thought, did not cling so stubbornly to stone. The powder, faint but distinct, suggested something else, something she would urge Inspector Craddock to test. As Clara resumed stirring, Miss Marple moved toward the pantry, her steps slow but purposeful. The narrow space was a labyrinth of shelves stocked with jars of preserves, sacks of grain, and a tin of biscuits labelled Cook's Own. Her eyes caught a glint behind a jar of gooseberry jam, a small glass vial, its label smudged but bearing the faint outline of a chemical symbol. She did not touch it, knowing the police must handle such evidence, but her heart quickened. The vial's placement, half hidden, suggested concealment, and its presence in Clara's domain was damning. Yet Miss Marple's mind cautioned against haste. A clever killer might plant such a clue to shift blame, and Clara's tension, her guarded replies, could stem from fear rather than guilt. Returning to the kitchen, Miss Marple engaged Clara in talk of herbs, coaxing her to describe the manor's garden. Rosemary and thyme, mostly, Clara said, her voice softening as she spoke of her craft. Mrs. Harrow liked fresh leaves in her tea sometimes, but not yesterday, just the caddy's blend. Miss Marple nodded, filing away the detail. The caddy's lock, Clara's key, the vial's hiding place, each was a piece of a puzzle, but the picture remained elusive. She thanked Clara and left, her mind turning to the conservatory, where the tea had been served and where, she hoped, further clues awaited. The conservatory was still cordoned off, a constable standing guard at its glass doors. Miss Marple approached with a gentle smile, her knitting bag swinging lightly at her side. "Might I have a word with Inspector Craddock, young man?" she asked, her tone that of a kindly aunt. The constable, disarmed by her frail appearance, hesitated, then nodded, fetching the inspector from within. Craddock emerged, his navy suit slightly rumpled, his eyes sharp but tired. "Miss Marple," he said, a note of respect in his voice. "You've been busy, I hear." She inclined her head, her expression mild. "Only observing, Inspector. The kitchen, I think, holds answers. A mortar with an odd powder, a vial behind. The jam, perhaps your men might look there." Craddock's eyebrows rose, but he jotted a note. "And the conservatory," she added. "My teacup, behind the palmets, still there, I trust." Craddock nodded, his gaze appraising. "It's with the lab now, along with the teapot. Early results suggest cyanide in the pot, but we're waiting on specifics. Your teacup may tell us more. Miss Marple's smile was faint. "I hope so, Inspector." The tea was distinctive. She paused, then added, "Mrs. Harrow's caddy, has it been examined?" Craddock frowned. "It's locked, as Mrs. Bates said. No signs of tampering, but we're testing the leaves." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. The caddy's lock was a barrier, but not an impenetrable one. A key could be copied, a lock picked, and the tea leaves, she suspected, were the poison's hiding place. With Craddock's permission, Miss Marple entered the conservatory, her eyes sweeping the scene. The mahogany table stood as it had yesterday, its linen cloth askew, the silver teapot removed, but the tiered stand still laden with untouched scones. The shattered remnants of Evelyn's teacup had been collected, but a faint stain marked the flagstones where it had fallen. Miss Marple moved to the palm where her own teacup had been hidden, noting its absence with satisfaction. The ferns and orchids, vibrant despite the tragedy, seemed to watch her, their silence a challenge. She pictured the tea service, Evelyn pouring, the cups passed around, the bitter taste lingering on her tongue. The poison, Craddock had said, was in the pot, suggesting a broader target or a miscalculation. Yet only Evelyn had died, her collapse, swift and singular. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the suspects, their roles in the conservatory's drama. Clara, who had brewed the tea, was the obvious focus, her access to the caddy and the kitchen's resources undeniable. Yet her fear, her insistence on the caddy's security, suggested a woman caught in a trap not of her making. Leonard Harrow, seated across from Evelyn, had watched her pour, his restless hands betraying a tension that belied his smooth account. Beatrice Lyle, beside Evelyn, had chattered brightly, her gaiety a mask that Miss Marple suspected hid financial strain. Tom Rigby, awkward at the table, had spoken of his orchids, but his shed, with its gardening chemicals, loomed as a possible source of cyanide. Each had opportunity, but motive remained the key, and Evelyn's secrets, her loans, her plans, her distrust, were the map to its discovery. Leaving the conservatory, Miss Marple returned to the morning room. Her knitting resumed as she sifted. Through her observations, the kitchen's clues and mortars, powder, the hidden vial pointed to Clara, but their very clarity made her wary. A murderer, she knew, often laid a trail to mislead, and Clara's role as cook made her an easy scapegoat. The caddy's lock, Evelyn's caution, the bitter teal suggested a deeper conspiracy, a betrayal by someone Evelyn trusted. Miss Marple recalled her village, where a grocer's wife had once hidden poison in a jar of sugar, framing a rival. Here, the stakes were higher, the players more cunning. But the human impulses, greed, fear, desperation, were unchanged. A soft knock announced the butler. Mr. Ellis, a dignified man whose usual composure was frayed. "Miss Marple, the inspector asks if you'd join him in the library," he said, his voice low. She nodded, gathering her knitting, and followed him through the manor's corridors, where portraits of Harrow ancestors seemed to watch with disapproval. The library was warm, its fire crackling, but the air was tense. Craddock stood by the desk, a small evidence bag in his hand. "Miss Marple," he said, his tone brisk but respectful, "your instincts were stand. The mortar in the kitchen traces of cyanide, ground fine. The vial too, though its label's too smudged to read. Mrs. Bates swears they're not hers." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed, though her expression remained mild. "And the caddy?" she asked. Craddock's jaw tightened. "The leaves are clean, but we're testing for residue. The lock's intact, but that doesn't mean much if someone had access." Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning over the new evidence. The cyanide in the mortar was damning, but its placement in Clara's kitchen felt too convenient, a signpost pointing too clearly to her guilt. The vial, hidden but not destroyed, suggested a killer confident in their misdirection. She recalled Evelyn's ledger, the £5,000 debt that bound Clara to her mistress. Debt was a motive, but so was inheritance for Leonard, financial ruin for Beatrice, or loss for Tom. The kitchen was the crime stage, but the script had been written elsewhere, in the manor's shadowed relationships. Inspector, Miss Marple said softly, "Might I suggest speaking to the staff about Mrs. Harrow's habits? Her tea ritual, her visitors' small details often reveal more than grand discoveries." Craddock's eyes narrowed, but he nodded, his respect deepening. "You've a knack for this, Miss Marple. We'll do it. Anything else?" She hesitated, her voice gentle. "Only that the kitchen is a busy place, Inspector. Many hands pass through, and not all are as loyal as they seem." Craddock jotted a note, his expression thoughtful, and Miss Marple left, her knitting bag swinging lightly at her side. Back in the morning room, she settled by the window, the manor's gardens a blur of green through the drizzle. Her needles clicked, each stitch a step toward clarity. The kitchen's clues were a starting point, but the truth lay in the suspect's heart's Leonard's ambition. Beatrice's debts, Tom's resentment, Clara's desperation. Evelyn's death was a carefully planned act, its roots in the manor's secrets, and Miss Marple was determined to unearth them. The tea, the cyanide, the locked caddy, they were the surface of a deeper mystery, and she would follow its threads through the lies and silences to the killer's hand. Chapter 6. The nephew's ambitions. The third day at Thornfield Manor unfolded under a sky bruised with clouds, the air sharp with the promise of rain. The manor's grandeur, its polished oak panelling, its crystal chandeliers seemed to sag under the weight of Evelyn Harrow's murder, as if the very walls mourned her loss. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a high-backed chair in the morning room, sipped a cup of chamomile tea, its mild flavour a deliberate contrast to the bitter Darjeeling that had ended Evelyn's life. Her lavender shawl was draped neatly over her shoulders, and her knitting needles moved with their steady, almost hypnotic rhythm, but her mind was a crucible of observation and deduction. The kitchen's clues, cyanide, dusted mortar. The hidden vial had sharpened her focus on Clara Bates, yet Miss Marple's instincts, honed by years of unravelling village intrigues, urged her to look beyond the obvious. Today, her attention turned to Leonard Harrow, Evelyn's charming nephew, whose ambitions and restless demeanour suggested a motive as compelling as any debt. The manor was quiet, its staff subdued as Inspector Craddock's men continued their meticulous search. The conservatory remained a sealed shrine to the crime, and the suspects, confined to the manor's grounds, moved like actors in a play paused mid-scene. Miss Marple had observed Leonard closely since her arrival, his polished manners, his quick smile, the way his dark eyes flickered with calculation when he spoke of his future. His account to Craddock casual conversations with Evelyn about business ventures had been smooth, but Miss Marple had noted the tension in his hands, the way his fingers drummed against his thigh, as if keeping time with an inner urgency. Evelyn's wealth, she knew, was his inheritance, but only if her death was deemed natural. A murder could entangle the estate in legal quagmires, delaying or denying his claim. Was Leonard desperate enough to gamble on poison? Miss Marple set aside her tea and rose, her frail frame moving with deceptive purpose. She sought Leonard in the gardens, where the roses, heavy with dew, bowed under the grey light. She found him near a marble fountain, its water silenced for the season, his dark hair ruffled by a fitful breeze. He was pacing, a cigarette burning unnoticed between his fingers, his tailored suit slightly askew as if he'd dressed in haste. At her approach, he straightened, his smile swift but strained. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice warm with practiced charm. "Escaping the manor's gloom, are you?" She returned his smile, her eyes gentle but probing. "The gardens are a tonic, Mr. Harrow, and I find a walk clears the mind. Might I join you?" Leonard hesitated, then nodded, tossing the cigarette into the grass. They strolled along a gravel path lined with lavender, Miss Marple's steps slow but steady, her knitting bag swinging lightly at her side. "You spoke of London at tea," she began, her tone conversational. "Such an exciting place for a young man with plans. Shipping, wasn't it?" Leonard's eyes lit, though his smile was cautious. "Yes, shipping. The docks are alive with opportunity, new routes, new markets. I've a mind to start a company, but it takes capital and—" "Aunt Evelyn," he trailed off, his jaw tightening. Miss Marple nodded, her expression sympathetic. She was cautious, I gather. Wise, but perhaps frustrating for a man of vision. Leonard's laugh was short, bitter. "Cautious is putting it kindly. She thought my ideas too risky, said I lacked experience. But I know the trade, talked to financiers, studied the markets. All I needed was her backing." His voice held a note of pleading, as if convincing Miss Marple might sway a ghost. She noted the clench of his fists, the way his eyes avoided hers, darting to the fountain's dry basin. "And now," she asked softly, "her passing must complicate things." Leonard's face paled, and he stopped, turning to face her. "It's a mess, isn't it? The will's tied up, the police sniffing around. I didn't want this, Miss Marple. I just wanted a chance." His voice cracked, but Miss Marple's keen gaze caught a flicker of something else, guilt, perhaps, or fear. They resumed walking, the gravel crunching underfoot. Miss Marple steered the conversation to Evelyn's habits, probing gently. "She was particular about her tea, I noticed, always pouring it herself." Leonard nodded, his expression distant. "Always. Said it was her ritual, like a queen holding court. That caddy of hers locked tighter than a bank vault." Miss Marple, needles tucked in her bag, seemed to click in her mind. The caddy, Clara's domain, was a constant in every suspect's story. Yet Leonard's mention of it felt rehearsed, as if he'd anticipated the question. She filed this away, her thoughts turning to his alibi alone in the drawing room before. Tea, unverified by any witness. Their walk led them to the edge of the estate, where the east field stretched toward a distant copse. Leonard gestured to it, his voice low. "She was going to sell this developer's, you know. A fortune, but it ruined the place. Tom was furious, and I wasn't thrilled either. Thornfield's my legacy." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Legacia, word heavy with entitlement. She recalled the ledger's loans, Evelyn's control over her circle. Leonard's inheritance was his motive, but his charm, his ease, could mask a darker resolve. "A legacy is a heavy burden," she said, her tone mild. "It can drive a man to desperate measures." Leonard's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. But he said nothing, his silence more telling than words. Miss Marple parted from him with a gentle smile, promising to join him for tea later, though her mind was already elsewhere. She made her way to the village, a short walk through lanes hedged with blackthorn, her straw hat shielding her from a light drizzle. St. Mary Mead had taught her the value of village gossip, and Thornfield's postmaster, Mr. Pym, was a likely source. His shop, a cluttered space of stamps and parcels, smelled of ink and wax. Mr. Pym, a wiry man with spectacles perched on his nose, greeted her warmly, recognizing her as a visitor to the manor. "Terrible business, Mrs. Harrow's death," he said, shaking his head. "The village is all aflutter." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of shared sorrow. "Indeed, Mr. Pym, poor Mr. Harrow Leonard, that is seems quite shaken. He mentioned business ventures in London. I suppose he's been in touch with financiers." Mr. Pym's eyes gleamed with the relish of a man who knew more than he. "Let on, OI telegrams, miss, near every day. Urgent ones, to a Mr. Carver in London. Something about loans, I reckon, though he was cagey about it." Miss Marple's lips pursed. Loans suggested debt, and debt, for a man like Leonard, could be a spur to murder. She thanked Mr. Pym, purchasing a postcard to maintain her guise, and left, her mind churning. Back at the manor, Miss Marple sought the butler, Mr. Ellis, whose dignified reserve masked a wealth of observation. She found him in the pantry, polishing silver with a care that bordered on ritual. "Mr. Ellis," she said, her voice soft, "you must know the manor's rhythms better than most." Mr. Harrow Leonard was he, often with his aunt before her passing. Ellis's cloth paused, his eyes meeting hers with a flicker of caution. He was, Miss Owis talking of his plans, trying to win her over. Mrs. Harrow listened, but she wasn't swayed. Said he needed to prove himself first. Miss Marple nodded, her expression thoughtful. "And the day of the tea-ware was he before joining us?" Ellis frowned, his memory straining. "In the drawing-room, I believe, Miss Alone, as far as I know." Alone, a word that offered no alibi, only opportunity. Miss Marple returned to the morning-room, her knitting resumed as she sifted through her findings. Leonard's ambitions were clear: a shipping venture, a fortune to be made, a legacy to claim. His telegrams to Carver, his pleas to Evelyn, his unverified movements before Tyle painted a picture of a man teetering on the edge of desperation. The cyanide, she knew, required access to the tea, and while Clara's kitchen was the likely stage, Leonard's presence in the manor offered chances to tamper. Had he slipped into the kitchen, using his charm to distract the staff? Or had he manipulated another Clara, perhaps to do his bidding? Miss Marple recalled a St. Mary Mead grocer whose debts had driven him to forge a will. Leonard's stakes were higher, his charm a sharper tool, but the impulse was the same. A knock interrupted her thoughts, and Inspector Craddock entered, his face etched with fatigue but his eyes alert. "Miss Marple," he said, closing the door, "your teacup's results are in. Cyanide, same as the teapot, though diluted. Seems the poison was in the brew, not just Mrs. Harrow's cup." Miss Marple nodded, her expression unchanged but her mind racing. The tea's contamination broadened the crime's scope, implicating Clara further but not exclusively. "And the vial from the kitchen?" she asked. Craddock's jaw tightened. "Gone. Someone moved it before we could bag it. Mrs. Bates swears it wasn't hers, but she's rattled." Miss Marple's needles paused. The vial's disappearance was a bold move, suggesting a killer confident in their control. Leonard, with his quick mind, could have orchestrated such a sleight. "Inspector," Miss Marple said softly, "might I suggest checking Mr. Harrow's correspondence? Telegrams, perhaps, to London. They may shed light on his pressures." Craddock's eyebrows rose, but he nodded, his respect deepening. "You're a step ahead, Miss Marple. We've got his room under search now." Anything else? She hesitated, her voice gentle. Only that ambition can blind a man, Inspector. Mr. Harrow's dreams are large, but his means may be limited. Craddock jotted a note, his expression thoughtful, and left, promising to keep her informed. Miss Marple settled back, her knitting a soft rhythm against the morning's quiet. The gardens outside were cloaked in mist, their beauty a mask for the manor's secrets. Leonard's ambitions, his shipping venture, his inheritance, his telegrams, were a tapestry of motive and opportunity. Yet the cyanide's path, from kitchen to teapot, required precision, and Miss Marple sensed a hand steadier than Leonard's charm suggested. Clara's kitchen, Beatrice's debts, Tom's shed each was a thread. But Leonard's role was central, his desperation a beacon in the fog. She recalled Evelyn's strained smile, her locked caddy, her distrust. The widow had sensed a threat, and Leonard, with his smiles and pleas, was its likeliest source. The manor's clock chimed, marking the slow march of the investigation. Miss Marple's needles clicked, each stitch a step toward clarity. Leonard's ambitions were a motive, but the truth lay in the interplay of all the suspects: Clara's fear, Beatrice's cunning, Tom's resentment. The tea, the cyanide, the vanished vial, they were signposts, and Miss Marple would follow them through the manor's shadows to the heart of the crime. Chapter 7. The Friends' Facade. The fourth day at Thornfield Manor dawned with a fitful sun, its rays piercing the mist that clung to the estate's rolling lawns. The manor, with its ivy-clad towers and gleaming windows, stood as a silent witness to the tragedy within, its elegance a brittle mask over the currents of suspicion that swirled among its inhabitants. Miss Jane Marple sat in the drawing-room, a spacious chamber of damask curtains and mahogany furniture, her lavender shawl draped over her shoulders. Her knitting needles moved with their familiar, unhurried precision, but her pale blue eyes were sharp, scanning the room's details: the faded portrait of a Harrow matriarch, the silver candelabra on the mantel, the faint scent of lavender, polish lingering in the air. The investigation into Evelyn Harrow's murder had deepened, with the cyanide-tainted tea and the kitchen's clues pointing to a calculated crime. Yet Miss Marple's instincts urged her to probe beyond the surface. Today, her focus settled on Mrs. Beatrice Lyle, Evelyn's vivacious friend, whose polished charm and carefully curated grief hinted at a motive cloaked in performance. The manor's routine had been disrupted, its guests confined to the grounds, as Inspector Craddock's men combed every corner for evidence. The conservatory, where Evelyn had collapsed, remained a sealed relic, its glass walls guarding the secrets of that fatal tea. Miss Marple had spent the morning reflecting on her findings: the cyanide in the teapot, the suspicious powder in Clara's mortar, the vanished vial, and Leonard's desperate ambitions. Each suspect was a thread in a tangled web, but Beatrice's role intrigued her most. Her laughter at tea had been too bright, her tears too timely, and her casual mention of a failed boutique and a debt to Evelyn had struck Miss Marple as a carefully dropped clue. Beatrice's poise, she suspected, was a facade, and behind it lay a motive as potent as any inheritance or grudge. Miss Marple rose, her frail frame moving with quiet purpose, and sought Beatrice in the music room, a smaller chamber adorned with a rosewood pianoforte and shelves of sheet music. She found her there, seated at the piano, her fingers idly tracing the keys without sound. Beatrice's navy frock, a departure from her usual vibrant hues, lent her an air of sombre elegance, but her posture was tense, her shoulders hunched as if bearing an unseen weight. At Miss Marple's entrance, she looked up, her smile swift, but strained. "Miss Marple, how kind of you to join me," she said, her voice warm but edged with a tremor. "This room is a comfort, don't you think? Evelyn loved it." Miss Marple nodded, settling into a velvet chair, her knitting bag at her side. "It's charming, Mrs. Lyle. Do you play often?" Beatrice's laugh was light, almost forced. "Not as much as I'd like." Evelyn was the true musician. She'd play for hours, lost in Chopin. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, a soothing counterpoint to the room's stillness. "You were close, I understand," she said, her tone inviting confidence. "Like sisters, you said?" Beatrice's eyes misted, and she turned back to the piano, her fingers brushing a silent chord. "We were. For years, we shared everything, secrets, dreams, laughter. But lately," she hesitated, her voice dropping. "Evelyn changed. She grew distant, always fussing over her tea, her letters, as if she didn't trust me." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened, though her expression remained gentle. The echo of Evelyn's distrust, noted by the housekeeper and now Beatrice, was a recurring motif, but Beatrice's delivery felt rehearsed, as if she were planting a seed of Evelyn's paranoia to deflect suspicion. Probing gently, Miss Marple steered the conversation to the past. "You mentioned a boutique in London, a bold venture. Such dreams are costly, I imagine." Beatrice's smile faltered, her hands stilling on the keys. "Oh, it was a whim, really. A little shop in Mayfair, all silks and hats. Evelyn lent me the money, generous, as always, but it failed. The rents, the trends, I couldn't keep up." Her voice was light, but Miss Marple caught the strain, the way her eyes darted to the window as if seeking escape. "And Evelyn, was she understanding?" Miss Marple asked, her tone mild. Beatrice's laugh was brittle. "At first, yes, but she wanted repayment, and I couldn't manage it. We had words, but it was nothing serious." Her words were dismissive, but Miss Marple's mind seized on the debtor sum. She suspected, far larger than Beatrice's airy tone implied. The conversation drifted to the day of the tea, and Miss Marple noted Beatrice's careful phrasing. "I was beside Evelyn, chattering about Paris, when it happened," Beatrice said, her eyes welling. "She poured the tea herself, you know, always so particular. I didn't touch the pot." Miss Marple nodded, recalling Beatrice's alibi playing in the music room before tea, though the maid had heard no music. "You must have been devastated," she said, her voice soft. Beatrice's tears spilled, and she reached for a silk handkerchief, her movements graceful but deliberate. "It was awful, Miss Marple." One moment she was smiling, the next she shuddered, but Miss Marple's keen eye caught the timing of her tears, the way they seemed to punctuate her words like stage cues. Grief, she knew, could be genuine, but Beatrice's felt like a performance, crafted to disarm. Leaving the music room, Miss Marple sought the maid, Jenny, a shy girl with a knack for noticing what others missed. She found her in the linen closet, folding sheets with brisk efficiency. "Jenny," Miss Marple said, her tone warm, "you're a great help in this house. Tell me, was Mrs. Lyle often in the music room before tea that day?" Jenny's hands paused, her eyes flickering with uncertainty. I don't think so, miss. I passed by and heard nothing, though she said she was practicing. I didn't want to pry." Miss Marple smiled, her expression encouraging. "Of course not, dear. And Mrs. Harrow's tea caddied. Anyone else ever handle it?" Jenny shook her head. "Only Mrs. Bates, miss. Mrs. Harrow was strict about it, kept the key herself sometimes. Miss Marple thanked her, her mind turning over the maid's words. Beatrice's alibi was shaky, and Evelyn's control over the caddy suggested a trust limited to Clariette trust Miss Marple knew could be exploited. Her next destination was the village, where the postmaster, Mr. Pym, had proven a font of local knowledge. The walk was brisk, the lanes lined with hedgerows glistening with dew. Mr. Pym's shop was as cluttered as before, its air thick with the scent of paper and sealing wax. He greeted her with a nod, his spectacles glinting. "Back again, Miss Marple. The manor's troubles are the talk of the village." She smiled, selecting a packet of envelopes to justify her visit. "So I gather, Mr. Pym, Mrs. Lyle, I hear, was quite the figure in Londoner boutique, I believe. Did she correspond much about it?" Mr. Pym's eyes gleamed. "Oh, aye. Letters to creditors, mostly, and a few to Mrs. Harrow, pleading for time. She owed a pretty sum, from what I heard, thousands, maybe. Not that she let on, all smiles and charm." Miss Marple's lips pursed. Thousands a debt that could crush a woman like Beatrice, whose poise depended on appearances. Back at the manor, Miss Marple sought the butler, Mr. Ellis, whose quiet observance missed little. She found him in the dining room, arranging cutlery with meticulous care. "Mr. Ellis," she said, her voice gentle, "Mrs. Lyle and Mrs. Harrow were close, I understand. Did they ever quarrel?" Ellis's polishing slowed, his eyes meeting. Hers with a flicker of caution. "Not openly, miss, but there was tension. Mrs. Lyle borrowed heavily, and Mrs. Harrow wasn't pleased when the money wasn't repaid. I heard them once, in the study, Mrs. Harrow saying she'd call in the debt if Mrs. Lyle didn't settle soon." Miss Marple nodded, her expression thoughtful. A threatened debt, a strained friendship, Beatrice's motive was taking shape. Her charm a mask for desperation. Miss Marple returned to the drawing room. Her knitting resumed as she sifted through her findings. Beatrice's facade, her laughter, her tears, her carefully chosen words, was a performance, but one with cracks. Her debt to Evelyn, likely substantial, was a motive as strong as Leonard's inheritance or Clara's loan. Her alibi, unconfirmed. By the maid, left her movements before tea a mystery, and her proximity to Evelyn at the table offered opportunity. The cyanide, Miss Marple knew, had been in the teapot, implicating Clara's preparation, but Beatrice's cunning could have exploited Clara's role, planting the poison to frame the cook. Miss Marple recalled a St. Mary Mead seamstress, whose charm had hidden a theft until a misplaced letter betrayed her. Beatrice's stakes were higher, her stage grander, but the pattern was familiar. A knock interrupted her thoughts, and Inspector Craddock entered, his face etched with the strain of a case growing more complex. "Miss Marple," he said, closing the door, "we've found something in Mrs. Lyle's rumour letter from Mrs. Harrow, demanding repayment of £3,000, dated 2 weeks ago. Mrs. Lyle claims it was settled, but there's no record of payment." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed, though her expression remained mild. "And the kitchen's vile?" she asked. Craddock's jaw tightened. "Still missing, but we're searching the grounds. The mortar's cyanide is confirmed, though Mrs. Bates denies it's hers." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. The letter was a damning clue, but Beatrice's denial suggested confidence or a deeper deception. The missing vial, she suspected, was no accident, but a calculated move to muddy the evidence. "Inspector," Miss Marple said softly, "might I suggest checking Mrs. Lyle's belongings for anything chemical? Perfumes, perhaps, or cosmetics. Such things can hide more than scent. Craddock's eyebrows rose, but he nodded, his respect deepening. You're a sharp one, Miss Marple. We'll look into it. Anything else? She hesitated, her voice gentle. Only that charm is a powerful tool, Inspector. Mrs. Lyle's smiles may hide more than we see. Craddock jotted a note, his expression thoughtful, and left, promising to update her on the search. Miss Marple settled back, her knitting a soft rhythm against the drawing-room's quiet. The gardens outside were shrouded in mist, their beauty a veil for the manor's secrets. Beatrice's facade, her debt, her shaky alibi, her calculated grief, was a tapestry of motive and opportunity. Yet the cyanide's path, from kitchen to teapot, required precision, and Miss Marple sensed a mind as sharp as Beatrice's behind it. Clara's fear, Leonard's desperation, Tom's resentment, each was a thread. But Beatrice's role was central, her charm a weapon as deadly as poison. She recalled Evelyn's locked caddy, her distrust, her strained smile at tea. The widow had sensed a betrayal, and Beatrice, with her laughter and tears, was its likeliest architect. The manor's clock chimed, marking the slow march of the investigation. Miss Marple's needles clicked, each stitch a step toward clarity. Beatrice's facade was a motive, but the truth lay in the interplay of all the suspects. Clara's loan, Leonard's inheritance, Tom's loss, the tea, the cyanide, the missing vial. They were signposts, and Miss Marple would follow them through the manor's shadows to the killer's hand. Chapter 8. The gardener's grudge, the 5th day at Thornfield Manor, greeted the world with a reluctant dawn. The sun struggling through a veil of pewter clouds that hung low over the estate's sprawling grounds. The manor's stately facade, with its ivy-draped stone and tall windows, seemed to huddle against the chill, its grandeur muted by the lingering shadow of Evelyn Harrow's murder. Miss Jane Marple sat in the library, a grand room of leather-bound tomes and flickering firelight, her lavender shawl draped neatly over her shoulders. Her knitting needles moved with their steady, almost meditative rhythm, but her pale blue eyes were alert, sifting through the intricate web of clues that had emerged over the past days. The cyanide-laced tea, the suspicious powder in Clara's kitchen, the vanished vial, Leonard's ambitions, and Beatrice's carefully crafted facade had each sharpened her focus. Yet Miss Marple's instincts, honed by years of unravelling the quiet sins of St. Mary Mead, urged her to probe further. Today her attention turned to Tom Rigby, the manor's taciturn gardener, whose devotion to the estate masked a simmering resentment that could have blossomed into murder. The investigation had settled into a tense rhythm, with Inspector Craddock's men combing the manor and its grounds for new evidence. The conservatory, where Evelyn had collapsed, remained sealed, its glass walls a silent sentinel over the fatal tea. The suspects, confined to the estate, moved with the wariness of players, in a game where every glance was a gambit. Miss Marple had observed Tom closely since her arrival, his weathered hands, his gruff reticence, the way his faded green eyes softened when he spoke of his orchids, but hardened at any mention of Evelyn's plans. His alibi polishing tools. In his shed before tea was solitary, unverified, and his shed, with its store of gardening chemicals, loomed as a potential source of the cyanide that had ended Evelyn's life. Miss Marple suspected that Tom's quiet intensity, his deep tie to the land, held a motive as potent as Leonard's greed or Beatrice's debts. She rose from her chair, her frail frame moving with quiet determination, and made her way to the gardens, where the air was sharp with the scent of damp earth and fading roses. The grounds were Tom's domain, a meticulously tended expanse of manicured hedges, vibrant flower beds, and a greenhouse that glowed like a jewel under the overcast sky. She found him near the orchid house, his broad shoulders hunched as he pruned a row of late-blooming chrysanthemums. His corduroy jacket was patched at the elbows, his boots caked with mud, but his movements were precise, almost reverent. At her approach, he straightened, his weathered face creasing with a wary frown. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice a low rumble, "come to see the flowers, have you?" She smiled, her expression warm but probing. "They're a credit to you, Mr. Rigby. Such beauty takes a lifetime of care. Might I walk with you a while?" Tom hesitated, his eyes narrowing, but he nodded, wiping his pruning shears on a rag. They strolled along a path lined with lavender, its scent mingling with the damp air. Miss Marple's step slow but deliberate, her knitting bag swinging lightly. At her side, "Mrs. Harrow spoke highly of your work," she began, her tone conversational. "She said the conservatory owed its splendor to you." Tom's face softened, a flicker of pride breaking through his reserve. "She did love the orchids," he said, his voice quieter now. "Took an interest, asked questions. Not many do." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes noting the way his hands tightened on the shears, the faint tremor that betrayed more than his words. She steered the conversation to the estate's future, probing gently. "The gardens are the heart of Thornfield, aren't they? It must pain you to think of changes." Tom's jaw clenched, and he stopped, his eyes fixed on a distant hedge. Change's eye. Mrs. Harrow was set on selling the East Field, my greenhouse. My life's work for some developers' houses. Said it had secured the estate's future. His voice was low, laced with bitterness. Future for who? Not for me, nor the land. Miss Marple's lips pursed. The East Field, she recalled, was also a sore point for Leonard. But for Tom, it was personal, a betrayal of his decades of labor. "That must have been distressing," she said softly, "to lose what you've built." Tom's eyes met hers, hard and unyielding. "Distressing don't cover it, miss. It's like losing a child." His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken anger, and Miss Marple filed them away, her mind turning to the cyanide source. They reached the greenhouse, a glass structure filled with the humid warmth of exotic blooms. Tom led her inside, his demeanor easing as he gestured to a row of orchids, their petals delicate as silk. "These are my pride," he said, his voice softening. Mrs. Harrow loved the white ones best. Miss Marple admired them, her eyes straying to a workbench in the corner, where jars of fertilizer and pest control sat in neat rows. Among them, she noted a small tin labeled potassium cyanide, its lid secured with a new padlock. "You're careful with your chemicals, I see," she said, her tone casual. Tom's face darkened, and he stepped between her and the bench, his posture defensive. "Have to be, miss. Dangerous stuff, locked up tight. Nobody gets in here without me." Miss Marple nodded, her expression unchanged, but her mind seized on the padlock's shine, its newness suggesting a recent replacement. Had the old lock been compromised? Had someone, Tom or another, used his supplies to deadly ends? Their walk continued to the shed, a weathered structure tucked behind a yew hedge. Its door was padlocked, but Miss Marple noted scratches around. The keyhole, faint but telling. "You keep your tools here, I presume?" she asked, her voice mild. Tom nodded, his eyes wary. "I and my chemicals, all locked, always have been." His insistence felt forced, and Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Dr. Haydock's mention of cyanide in gardening supplies. Tom's shed, like Clara's kitchen, was a plausible source, but his defensiveness, his solitary alibi, made him a figure of interest. She thanked him for the tour, her smile disarming, and left, promising to visit the greenhouse again. Tom's grudge, she sensed, was a motive as raw as Leonard's ambition or Beatrice's desperation, but its depth required further exploration. Miss Marple's next destination was the manor staff quarters, where she sought the undergardener, a lanky youth named Will, whose loose tongue had already proven useful. She found him in the stables, polishing a saddle with a rag. "Will," she said, her tone warm, "you work closely with Mr. Rigby, don't you? He's devoted to the gardens." Will grinned, his freckled face open. "Aye, miss, Tom's married to them flowers." Near broke his heart when Mrs. Harrow talked of selling the East Field. He'd mutter about it for hours, said she didn't understand what she was throwing away. Miss Marple nodded, her expression thoughtful. "And his shed does he keep?" It locked. Will's grin faded, his eyes flickering with caution. "Supposed to, miss, but I seen him forget sometimes. Old lock was loose, too, till he got a new one last week." Miss Marple's lips pursed. A loose lock, a new padlock, small details, but telling. She thanked Will, slipping him a shilling for his trouble, and moved on, her mind churning. Back at the manor, Miss Marple sought the housekeeper, Mrs. Gibbs, whose harried efficiency masked a keen eye for the household's undercurrents. She found her in the linen room, folding napkins with brisk precision. "Mrs. Gibbs," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle, "Mr. Rigby's greenhouse is a marvel." Was Mrs. Harrow often there? Mrs. Gibbs's hands paused, her eyes meeting Miss Marple's with a flicker of unease. Now and then, she'd check on the orchids, but lately she and Mr. Rigby had words about the East Field, you see. He took it hard, said she was ruining his legacy. Miss Marple nodded, her expression sympathetic. "And his shed, did anyone else have access?" Mrs. Gibbs frowned, her memory straining. "Not that I know, miss, but it's off the path. Someone could have slipped in, I suppose, if the lock wasn't tight." Miss Marple thanked her, her mind seizing on the shed's vulnerability. A chink in Tom's armour of solitude. Returning to the library, Miss Marple settled with her knitting, the fire's crackle a soft backdrop to her thoughts. Tom's grudges, anger over the East Field, his protective stance over his chemicals was a motive as tangible as Clara's debt or Beatrice's debts. His shed, with its cyanide and questionable lock, offered means, and his solitary alibi before tea provided opportunity. Yet Miss Marple's instincts cautioned against simplicity. Tom's devotion to the gardens was genuine, his anger raw, but his reticence felt more like fear than guilt. Could he have been manipulated? His supplies used to frame him as Clara's. Kitchen had been used. She recalled a St. Mary Mead farmer whose tools had been stolen to cover a theft. Tom's shed, she suspected, was a stage, but the director was another. A knock interrupted her reverie, and Inspector Craddock entered, his face etched with the strain of a case growing ever more tangled. "Miss Marple," he said, closing the door, "we've checked Rigby's shed. The cyanide tin's secure, but the old lock found in a drawer shows signs of tampering. Scratches, like someone picked it." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed, though her expression remained mild. "And the new lock?" she asked. Craddock's jaw tightened. "Recent, as you suspected. Rigby claims he changed it for safety, but he's cagey about when." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. The tampered lock suggested access, but by whom? Tom, or another exploiting his negligence? And Mrs. Lyle's belongings, she added. Recalling her suggestion, Craddock's eyes narrowed. Nothing yet, but we're looking. Her letter from Mrs. Harrows, a strong lead £3,000, unpaid. Miss Marple's needles paused. Beatrice is dead. Tom's, cyanide each, was a thread, but the pattern was incomplete. Inspector, Miss Marple said softly, might I suggest asking the staff about visitors to the greenhouse? Mr. Rigby's orchids drew attention, and attention draws opportunity. Craddock's eyebrows rose, but he nodded, his respect deepening. You're a marvel, Miss Marple. We'll do it. Anything else? She hesitated, her voice gentle. Only that loyalty can blind, Inspector. Mr. Rigby's love for the land is deep, but it may have been used against him. Craddock jotted a note, his expression thoughtful, and left, promising to keep her informed. Miss Marple settled back, her knitting a soft rhythm against the library's quiet. The gardens outside were cloaked in dusk, their beauty a mask for the manor's secrets. Tom's grudge, his anger, his cyanide, his tampered lock was a tapestry of motive and means. Yet the cyanide's path, from shed to teapot, required cunning, and Miss Marple sensed a mind sharper than Tom's quiet devotion. Clara's kitchen, Leonard's ambition, Beatrice's charm, each was a thread, but Tom's role was pivotal. His shared a potential key. She recalled Evelyn's caution, her locked caddy, her strained glance at tea. The widow had feared betrayal. And Tom, with his silent rage, was a piece of that puzzle. The manor's clock chimed, marking the slow march of the investigation. Miss Marple's needles clicked, each stitch a step toward clarity. Tom's grudge was a motive, but the truth lay in the interplay of all the suspects: Clara's debt, Leonard's greed, Beatrice's deception. The tea, the cyanide, the tampered locked, they were signposts, and Miss Marple would follow them, through the manor's shadows, to the killer's hand. Chapter 9. The Teacup's Tale. The sixth day at Thornfield Manor dawned with a fragile clarity, the clouds parting to bathe the estate in a pale golden light that seemed almost mocking in its serenity. The manor's grandeur, its ivy-clad stone, its tall windows reflecting the morning, stood in stark contrast to the dark undercurrents of suspicion that pulsed within. Miss Jane Marple sat in the morning room, a quiet space of chintz curtains and faded watercolours, her lavender shawl draped neatly over her shoulders. Her knitting needles moved with their familiar, unhurried rhythm, but her pale blue eyes were sharp, sifting through the intricate tapestry of clues that had emerged over the past days. The cyanide-laced tea, the suspicious powder in Clara's kitchen, the vanished vial, Leonard's ambitions, Beatrice's facade, and Tom's grudge had each added depth to the mystery. Yet Miss Marple's instincts, honed by years of unravelling the quiet scenes of St. Mary Mead, urged her to focus on the crime's heart, the tea itself, and the teacup she had preserved, which now held the promise of truth. The manor was a hive of subdued activity, its staff moving with hushed steps as Inspector Craddock's men continued their relentless search. The conservatory, where Evelyn Harrow had collapsed, remained sealed, its glass walls a silent guardian of the fatal moment. The suspects, confined to the estate, carried themselves with a brittle wariness, their every interaction laced with unspoken accusations. Miss Marple had spent the previous evening reflecting on the investigation's progress. The cyanide confirmed in the teapot, the tampered lock on Tom's shed, the damning letter in Beatrice's room, and the persistent shadow over Clara's kitchen. Each clue was a thread, but the teacup she had hidden behind the conservatory's palm was a linchpin. Its contents a potential map to the killer's hand. She awaited Craddock's latest findings with a patience born of experience, but her mind was already tracing the tea's journey from caddy to pot to cup. Miss Marple rose, her frail frame moving with quiet purpose, and made her way to the library, where Craddock had promised to meet her with the lab results. The library was a grand space, its walls lined with leather-bound volumes and portraits of Harrow ancestors, their stern gazes seeming to judge the living. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow over the heavy oak furniture, but the air was thick with tension. She settled into a backed chair, her knitting bag at her side, and let her eyes roam the room, noting the faint dust on a shelf, the slightly askew frame of a painting, small signs of a household disrupted by tragedy. Her thoughts turned to Evelyn's final moments, the bitter tea, the sudden gasp, the shattered teacup scattering across the flagstones. The poison, she knew, was in the teapot, but its precise delivery remained a puzzle, and the teacup's tale was her next step toward clarity. Inspector Craddock entered, his navy suit rumpled from sleepless nights, his clipped mustache framing a face etched with determination. He carried a manila folder, its edges creased, and his eyes met Miss Marple's with a mix of respect and urgency. "Miss Marple," he said, closing the door, "your teacup's results are in, and they're telling." He sat across from her, opening the folder to reveal a typed report. "Cyanide, as we suspected, in your teacup and the teapot's residue. The concentration was low enough to kill one, perhaps two, but not the whole party. It was mixed with the tea leaves before brewing, not added to a single cup." Miss Marple nodded, her expression mild but her mind racing. The poison's presence in the pot confirmed a broader intent, yet only Evelyn had died, suggesting either precision or miscalculation. "And the caddy?" she asked, her voice soft but pointed. Craddock's jaw tightened. "The leaves inside are clean, but we found traces of cyanide on the inner lid. Someone opened it, tampered with the blend, then locked it again." Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes gleaming with quiet intensity. The caddy, Clara's domain, was the crime's fulcrum, but its locked nature complicated the picture. Clara's key, her insistence on sole access, made her the obvious suspect. Yet Miss Marple's instincts recoiled from such simplicity. "The lock was intact, I presume?" she asked. Craddock nodded, his expression grim. "No signs of forcing, but a key could have been copied or borrowed. Mrs. Bates is adamant she never let it out of her sight, but she's shaken more than I'd expect from innocence." Miss Marple's lips pursed. Clara's fear, she suspected, stemmed from vulnerability, not guilt. A clever killer might have used her role to frame her, just as Tom's shed or Beatrice's debts could be misdirection. "And the vial from the kitchen," she added, recalling its mysterious disappearance. Craddock's eyes narrowed. "Still missing. Someone's covering their tracks, and doing it well." The inspector leaned forward, his voice lowering. "Miss Marple, you've a knack for seeing what we miss. The teacups, yours any thoughts on how it fits?" She hesitated, her tone deferential but firm. "Only that the tea tells a story, Inspector. The poison was in the pot, yet only Mrs. Harrow died. Either the killer meant to target her alone, or they misjudged the dose. The caddy's tampering points to preparation, not impulse, and preparation requires access and trust." Craddock jotted a note, his respect deepening. "Trust," he echoed. Mrs. Harrow was cautious, locking everything. Who'd she trust enough to let near her tea? Miss Marple's smile was faint. That, Inspector, is the question. Mrs. Bates brewed the tea, but others moved through the manor. A moment's distraction, a sleight of hand opportunity, is a subtle thing. Craddock left to coordinate his team, promising to investigate. The caddies key further, and Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her thoughts turning to the conservatory's tableau. She pictured the tea service, Evelyn pouring, her hands steady despite a faint tremor. Leonard watching his charm masking tension. Beatrice chattering, her gaiety a performance. Tom shifting awkwardly, his eyes on his cup. Clara hovering, her face flushed with more than heat. The teapot had been central, its contents shared, yet the cyanide's effect was singular. Miss Marple recalled the bitter taste in her own tea, masked by sugar, and the faint almond-like scent near Evelyn's. Shattered cup. The poison's delivery was precise, but its presence in the pot suggested a broader risk lest the killer knew Evelyn's habits. Her insistence on the first pour dot to test her theory, Miss Marple sought the butler, Mr. Ellis, whose quiet observance was a goldmine of detail. She found him in the pantry, polishing a silver tray with meticulous care. "Mr. Ellis," she said, her voice warm, "Mrs. Harrow's tea. Ritual can you describe it?" Ellis's cloth paused, his eyes meeting hers, with a flicker of curiosity. "Very particular, Miss. She'd have Mrs. Bates brew her special blend, then pour the first cup herself, always. Said it was her privilege." The rest of us waited. Miss Marple nodded, her expression thoughtful. The first prevalence habit could have been the killer's target, ensuring she received the lethal dose before the tea diluted further. And the caddies keyed Mrs. Bates, ever leave it unattended. Ellis frowned, his memory straining. "Not that I saw, miss, but the kitchen's busy." A moment's lapse, and someone could have slipped in. Miss Marple thanked him, her mind seizing on the kitchen's chaos as a window of opportunity. Her next stop was the village, where the postmaster, Mr. Pym, had proven a reliable source of local insight. The walk was brisk, the lanes lined with hedgerows glistening with morning dew. Mr. Pym's shop, cluttered with stamps and parcels, smelled of ink and wax. He greeted her with a nod, his spectacles glinting. "Miss Marple, back again? The manor's troubles are all anyone talks of." She smiled, selecting a packet of notepaper to maintain her guise. "Indeed, Mr. Pym, Mrs. Harrow's tea, was it a topic in the village? Her special blend, I mean." Mr. Pym's eyes gleamed. "Oh, aye, she'd order it from a London shop, locked in that caddy-like gold. Mrs. Bates grumbled about it, said it was a fuss, but she followed orders." Miss Marple's lips pursed. Clara's grumbling suggested frustration, but also familiarity, knowledge of the caddy's contents that others might have exploited. She thanked Mr. Pym and left, her mind turning to the manor staff, who saw more than they said. Back at the manor, Miss Marple sought the maid, Jenny, whose shy demeanor hid a sharp eye. She found her in the scullery, scrubbing pots with vigor. "Jenny," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle, "you're a great help in the kitchen. Did you ever see anyone near Mrs. Harrow's tea caddy, besides Mrs. Bates?" Jenny's hands stilled, her eyes flickering with unease. "Not really, miss. It was Mrs. Bates's job, and she was fierce about it. But once I saw Mrs. Lyle in the kitchen, early, before tea. She said she was looking for sugar, but she was near the caddy's shelf." Miss Marple nodded, her expression encouraging. "And Mr. Harrow, or Mr. Rigby?" Jenny shook her head. "Not that I saw, miss, but the kitchen's always busy folks come and go." Miss Marple thanked her, slipping her a peppermint, and moved on, her mind seizing on Beatrice's presence near the caddy, a detail that sharpened her suspicions. Returning to the library, Miss Marple settled with her knitting, the fire's warmth a contrast to the chill of her thoughts. The teacup's tail cyanide in the pot, traces on the caddy's lid, was a narrative of preparation and betrayal. Clara's role as the tea's preparer was central, but Beatrice's kitchen visit, Leonard's unverified movements, and Tom's tampered shed offered other paths. Miss Marple pictured the caddy, lacquered, locked, a symbol of Evelyn's control. Its key, Clara's responsibility, was a vulnerability, and the kitchen's bustle a stage for deception. She recalled a St. Mary Mead baker, whose flour had been tainted to ruin a rival. Here, the stakes were higher, the players more cunning. But the pattern was familiar, a trusted ritual turned deadly. A knock interrupted her reverie, and Craddock entered, his face grim but alert. "Miss Marple," he said, closing the door, "we've questioned the staff about the caddy. The cook's key was kept on a ring in her apron, but she admits it was left on the counter once or twice during busy hours. No one saw it taken, but—" He trailed off, his eyes meeting hers. Miss Marple nodded, her expression unchanged but her mind racing. A borrowed key, a moment's access enough to tamper with the leaves. And Mrs. Lyle's belongings? She asked, recalling her suggestion of hidden chemicals. Craddock's jaw tightened. "We found a perfume bottle, empty but with a faint chemical residue. Lab's testing it now." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. A perfume bottle a woman's hiding place, and Beatrice's poise made her a likely candidate. "Inspector," Miss Marple said softly, "might I suggest checking the manor's waste bins? The missing vial may have been discarded, but not far." Craddock's eyebrows rose, but he nodded, his respect deepening. "You're a step ahead, Miss Marple. We'll look. Anything else?" She hesitated, her voice gentle. "Only that trust is a fragile thing, Inspector. Mrs. Harrow's tea was her ritual, but someone turned it against her." Craddock jotted a note, his expression thoughtful, and left, promising to update her on the perfume bottle's analysis. Miss Marple settled back, her knitting a soft rhythm against the library's quiet. The gardens outside shimmered in the morning light, their beauty a veil for the manor's secrets. The teacups, tail cyanide in the pot, a tampered caddy was a story of betrayal, its roots in Evelyn's circle. Clara's key, Beatrice's cunning, Leonard's desperation, Tom's anger each was a thread. But the teacup pointed to a killer who knew Evelyn's habits, her first pour, her trust. Miss Marple recalled Evelyn's strained glance, her locked caddy, her air of unease. The widow had sensed danger, and the tea, her daily solace, had been her undoing. The manor's clock chimed, marking the slow march of the investigation. Miss Marple's needles clicked, each stitch a step toward clarity. The teacup's tale was a motive, but the truth lay in the interplay of all the suspects Clara's fear. Leonard's greed, Beatrice's deception, Tom's grudge. The tea, the cyanide, the tampered caddy, they were signposts, and Miss Marple would follow them through the manor's shadows to the killer's hand. Chapter 10. The Cook's Confession, the seventh day at Thornfield Manor, unfolded under a sky of unrelenting grey, the clouds heavy with the threat of rain that seemed to mirror the oppressive atmosphere within. The manor's stately halls, with their polished oak and glittering chandeliers, felt stifled, as if the very air recoiled from the stain of Evelyn Harrow's murder. Miss Jane Marple sat in the drawing-room, a grand space of damask curtains and ancestral portraits, her lavender shawl draped neatly over her shoulders. Her knitting needles moved with their familiar, almost hypnotic rhythm, but her pale blue eyes were sharp, sifting through the intricate web of clues that had emerged over the past days. The cyanide-laced tea, the tampered caddy, the suspicious powder in the kitchen, the vanished vial, Leonard's ambitions, Beatrice's facade, and Tom's grudge had each deepened the mystery. But the confirmation of cyanide in her own teacup had sharpened Miss Marple's focus on the tea's preparation. Today, her attention turned to Clara Bates, the cook, whose role in brewing the fatal tea and whose crushing debt to Evelyn made her a central figure yet, one whose fear suggested more than guilt. The investigation had reached a fevered pitch, with Inspector Craddock's men scouring the manor and grounds for the elusive vial and any trace of the killer's missteps. The conservatory, where Evelyn had collapsed, remained a sealed shrine, its glass walls guarding the moment of betrayal. The suspects, confined to the estate, moved with a strained civility, their glances heavy with unspoken accusations. Miss Marple had spent the previous evening reflecting on the teacup's tale, the cyanide in the teapot, the tampered caddy, and the faint chemical residue in Beatrice's perfume bottle. Each clue pointed to a crime of meticulous planning, yet Clara's kitchen, where the tea was brewed, was the stage, and Clara herself, with her £5,000 debt, was the most obvious player. But Miss Marple's instincts, honed by years of unravelling the quiet scenes of St. Mary Mead, cautioned against the obvious. Clara's fear, her trembling hands, her insistence on the caddy's securities, suggested a woman ensnared, perhaps, not by her own hand, but by another's cunning dot. Miss Marple rose, her frail frame moving with quiet determination, and made her way to the kitchen, where Clara reigned over a domain of copper pots and herb-scented air. The kitchen was quieter today. The breakfast rush subsided, but the flagstone floor still gleamed, and the oak table bore the scars of countless meals. Clara stood at the counter, kneading dough with a ferocity that seemed to vent her inner turmoil, her broad face flushed and her eyes red-rimmed. At Miss Marple's entrance, she froze, her hands dusted with flour, her gaze darting to the door as if expecting an ambush. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice low and strained, "what brings you here? I've work to do." Miss Marple smiled, her tone warm and disarming. "I've no wish to disturb you, Mrs. Bates. Your bread is the talk of the manor. Such skill deserves praise. Might I sit a moment? The kitchen's warmth is a comfort." Clara hesitated, her hands resuming their kneading with less vigour, and nodded curtly, gesturing to a stool by the table. Miss Marple settled there, her knitting bag at her side, and let her eyes roam the familiar space. The high shelf where the lacquered tea caddy stood, its brass lock gleaming, the jars of spices and preserves lining the walls, the mortar and pestle now cleaned but once dusted with cyanide. The vial, she recalled, was still missing, its absence a deliberate act to obscure the truth. "Mrs. Harrow's tea," Miss Marple began, her voice conversational, "was a ritual, wasn't it? You took such care with her blend." Clara's flush deepened, and she pounded the dough harder, her eyes fixed on the table. "I, miss, her special leaves, locked in that caddy. I brewed it, as always, no different." Her voice was defiant, but Miss Marple caught the quiver in it, the edge of desperation. "You must have been proud to serve her," Miss Marple continued, her tone gentle, "though I hear she could be demanding about her tea, her accounts." Clara's hands stilled, and her eyes flicked to Miss Marple, wary and haunted. "She was particular. I wanted things just so. But I did my duty." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking softly, a soothing counterpoint to Clara's tension. Duty is a heavy load, especially with obligations. I understand she lent you money, a generous act, but perhaps a burden. Clara's face crumpled, and she sank onto a stool, her flour-dusted hands covering her eyes. You know, then, she whispered, £5,000, miss. I couldn't pay it back, not with my wages. She was pressing me, threatening to take my cottage, my home. Miss Marple's expression was sympathetic, but her mind was alert, cataloguing Clara's words, her trembling hands, the raw fear in her voice. That must have been dreadful, she said softly, to feel so trapped. Clara's tears spilled, streaking her flowered cheeks, and her voice broke. I was desperate, miss, but I swear I didn't kill her. I brewed the tea, yes, but it was clean. That vial, that powder, they weren't mine. Her words tumbled out, a flood of panic, and Miss Marple listened, her needle still, her eyes gentle but probing. Clara's denial was fervent, her fear palpable, but her access to the caddy, her debt, made her the perfect scapegoater, the perfect culprit. Miss Marple recalled a St. Mary Mead shopkeeper, whose debts had driven her to despair but not to crime, framed by a rival's cunning. Clara's story felt similar, but the truth required more, leaving Clara to her dough. Miss Marple sought Inspector Craddock, whom she found in the library, poring over a stack of reports. His navy suit was creased, his eyes shadowed, but his nod to her was respectful, acknowledging her uncanny knack for insight. Miss Marple, he said, gesturing to a chair, Mrs. Bates is unraveling. We questioned her again, and she broke down, admitted the debt. £5,000, and Evelyn's threats to seize her cottage. She swears she's innocent, but the cyanide in her kitchen's hard to ignore. Miss Marple settled into the chair, her knitting resumed, and nodded thoughtfully. Her fear is genuine, Inspector, but fear can come from being trapped as much as from guilt. The vial's absence troubles Mitt's too convenient, too calculated. Craddock's eyes narrowed, and he leaned forward, his folder open. The perfume bottle from Mrs. Lyle's room lab says it held cyanide, diluted but unmistakable. She claims it's a mix-up, but it's a strong lead. Miss Marple's lips pursed, her mind seizing on the perfume bottle, a woman's hiding place, and Beatrice's poise made her a likely architect of such deception. And the caddy's key? She asked, her voice soft but pointed. Craddock frowned, flipping a page. Mrs. Bates says it was always with her, but the maid, Jenny, saw it on the counter once, during a busy morning. Anyone could have taken it, copied it, returned it. Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts racing. The key's vulnerability was a chink in Clara's armor, but the cyanide's presence in the teapot, not just Evelyn's cup, suggested a broader intentor, a misdirection to implicate the cook. The mortar's powder, she added, was it tested further? Craddock nodded, his expression grim. Pure cyanide, ground fine, as you suspected. Mrs. Bates denies it, but it was in her kitchen, under her nose. Miss Marple's needles clicked, her mind turning to the kitchen's chaos, a bustling space where a moment's distraction could allow tampering. Inspector, she said gently, might I suggest searching the manor's outbuildings? The vial's absence suggests it was hidden, not destroyed, and a shed or cellar might hold it. Craddock's eyebrows rose, but he nodded, his respect deepening. You're a marvel, Miss Marple. We'll check the grounds again. Anything else? She hesitated, her voice soft. Only that desperation is a powerful force, Inspector, but so is cunning. Mrs. Bates is a target, but the hand that placed the cyanide may belong to another. Craddock jotted a note, his expression thoughtful, and left, promising to update her on the search. Miss Marple returned to the drawing-room, her knitting a soft rhythm against the morning's quiet. She pictured Clara in the kitchen, her hands kneading dough, her face etched with fear. The £5,000 debt, Evelyn's threats, the cyanide in the mortar all painted a damning picture, yet Clara's confession felt too raw, too uncalculated for a murderer's guile. Miss Marple recalled the caddy, lacquered, locked, a symbol of Evelyn's control. Clara's key was a vulnerability, but the kitchen's bustle offered opportunity to others. Beatrice, with her sly visit, Leonard, with his unverified movements, Tom, with his tampered shed. The teapot's contamination suggested a killer who knew Evelyn's ritual, her first pour, but who also risked others drinking the tainted tea. Was it a calculated sacrifice, or a frame to bury Clara in guilt? To deepen her understanding, Miss Marple sought the undercook Sarah, a stout woman with a nonsense air, whom she found in the scullery peeling potatoes. "Sarah," Miss Marple said, her tone warm, "you work closely with Mrs. Bates. Her tea-making, was it always the same?" Sarah's knife paused, her eyes meeting Miss Marple's with a flicker of caution. "Aye, miss, like clockwork." She'd unlock the caddy, measure the leaves, brew it just so. Mrs. Harrow was fussy, wouldn't have it any other way. Miss Marple nodded, her expression encouraging. "And the key, did she ever misplace it?" Sarah frowned, her memory straining. "Once or twice, miss, left it on the counter when we were rushed. I told her to be careful, but she said no wand touch it." Miss Marple thanked her, slipping her a peppermint, and moved on, her mind seizing on the key's exposure. A moment's lapse that could have been exploited. Her next stop was the manor's grounds, where she revisited the conservatory's exterior, its glass walls glinting in the weak sunlight. The constable at the door nodded, allowing her a brief glance inside. The mahogany table stood unchanged, its linen cloth askew, the tiered stand of scones now stale. Miss Marple pictured the tea service, Evelyn pouring, her hand steady but tremulous, Clara hovering, her face flushed, Beatrice chattering, Leonard watching, Tom shifting. The teapot, now in the lab, had held the poison, but the caddies tampered. Lid pointed to preparation in the kitchen. She recalled Clara's confession, her tears, her denial of the vial and powder. The cook's fear was real, but her role as the tea's preparer made her a perfect pornor, a perfect culprit. Back in the drawing-room, Miss Marple settled with her knitting, the fire's crackle a soft backdrop to her thoughts. Clara's confession, her debt, her desperation. Her denial was a narrative of entrapment, but its very clarity made Miss Marple wary. A murderer, she knew, often laid a trail to mislead, in Clara's kitchen, with its cyanide and missing vial, was too convenient to stage. She recalled a St. Mary Mead widow, whose debts had been used to frame her for a theft she didn't commit. Clara's plight was similar, but the stakes were higher, the players more cunning. The caddy's key, the teapot's poison. Evelyn's ritual law pointed to a killer who knew the manor's rhythms, who exploited trust to deadly ends. A knock interrupted her thoughts, and Craddock entered, his face grim but alert. "Miss Marple," he said, closing the door, "we found the vial in a cellar, hidden in a crate of old bottles. It's cyanide, same as the mortar. Mrs. Bates nearly fainted when we showed her, swears it's not hers." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed, though her expression remained mild. The vial's recovery, far from the kitchen, suggested a killer's attempt to distance it from Clara, yet its discovery tightened the noose around her. "And Mrs. Lyle's perfume bottle?" she asked. Craddock's jaw tightened. "Confirmed cyanide, but she's sticking to her story a mistake. She says we're pressing her." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. Beatrice's bottle, Clara's vial, the caddy's lid, each was a piece. But the puzzle's shape was elusive. "Inspector," Miss Marple said softly, "might I suggest checking the manor's visitor's log? Someone may have seen the caddy's key or the kitchen's chaos and used it." Craddock's eyebrows rose, but he nodded, his respect deepening. "You're a step ahead, Miss Marple. We'll look. Anything else?" She hesitated, her voice gentle. "Only that innocence can look like guilt, Inspector. Mrs. Bates's fear is her prison, but the key to her freedom lies in another's hands." Craddock jotted a note, his expression thoughtful, and left, promising to update her on the log. Miss Marple settled back, her knitting a soft rhythm against the drawing-room's quiet. The gardens outside were cloaked in twilight, their beauty a veil for the manor secrets. Clara's confession, her debt, her tears, her denial, was a tapestry of motive and vulnerability. Yet the cyanide's path, from caddy to teapot, required cunning, and Miss Marple sensed a mind sharper than Clara's panic, Beatrice's deception, Leonard's greed, Tom's anger. Each was a thread. But Clara's role was central, her kitchen the stage. She recalled Evelyn's unease, her locked caddy, her strained glance at tea. The widow had feared betrayal, and Clara, with her trembling hands, was its likeliest victim or its architect. The manor's clock chimed, marking the slow march of the investigation. Miss Marple's needles clicked, each stitch a step toward clarity. Clara's confession was a motive, but the truth lay in the interplay of all the suspects: Beatrice's cunning, Leonard's desperation, Tom's grudge, the tea, the cyanide. The recovered vial, they were signposts, and Miss Marple would follow them, through the manor's shadows, to the killer's hand. Chapter 11. The final thread, the 8th day at Thornfield Manor, dawned with a deceptive calm. The sky a pale canvas, streaked with wisps of cloud that softened the estate's rolling hills. Yet within the manor's grand halls, where polished oak and crystal gleamed, a restless tension simmered, as if the very walls sensed the investigation's nearing climax. Miss Jane Marple sat in the morning room, a quiet haven of chintz and faded watercolors, her lavender shawl draped neatly over her shoulders. Her knitting needles lay idle in her lap, a rare pause, for her mind was wholly consumed by the intricate tapestry of clues woven over the past week. The cyanide-laced tea, the tampered caddy, the recovered vial, Clara's confession, Leonard's ambitions, Beatrice's facade, and Tom's grudge had each revealed facets of Evelyn Harrow's murder. But the final thread, the key to the killer's identity, remained tantalizingly out of reach. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes, sharp behind their mild facade, were fixed on a single certainty. The truth lay in the interplay of trust and betrayal, and today she would unravel it. The manor was subdued, its staff moving with the hushed efficiency of those aware of a storm's approach. Inspector Craddock's men had scoured every corner, their findings piling like leaves: cyanide in the teapot and Miss Marple's teacup, traces on the caddy's lid, the mortar's damning powder, the vial hidden in the cellar, and the faint residue in Beatrice's perfume bottle. Clara's £5,000 debt, Leonard's inheritance, Beatrice's £3,000 loan, and Tom's anger over the East Field, each offered motive. But the tea's preparation, Clara's domain, remained the crime's heart. Yet Miss Marple's instincts honed by years of untangling St. Mary Mead's quiet sins, recoiled from Clara's obvious guilt. The cook's fear, her raw confession, felt like the panic of a pawn, not a queen. The killer, she sensed, had orchestrated a frame, using Clara's kitchen as a stage, and the final thread would expose the hand behind the curtain. Miss Marple rose, her frail frame moving with quiet purpose, and made her way to the conservatory's exterior, where the glass walls glinted in the morning light. The room was still sealed, a constable at its door, but she paused, picturing the fatal tea, Evelyn pouring, her hands tremulous, Clara hovering, flushed, Leonard watching, tense, Beatrice chattering, performative, Tom shifting, uneasy. The teapots, cyanide, diluted but lethal, had targeted Evelyn's first pour, her ritual, suggesting a killer who knew her habits intimately. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the caddy's key, left briefly on the kitchen counter, and the vials, calculated, hiding in the cellar. These were not the acts of a desperate cook, but of a mind adept at misdirection. She recalled a St. Mary Mead widow, framed for theft by a rival's planted evidence. Here, the stakes were higher, the players more cunning, but the pattern was familiar, a scapegoat crafted to obscure the true culprit. Her first task was to revisit Evelyn's study, where the ledger had revealed Clara's debt and Beatrice's loan. The room, with its mahogany desk and rose garden view, was quiet, the air heavy with the scent of old leather and wax. Miss Marple slipped inside, her steps muffled by the Persian rug, and approached the desk where the locked drawer had yielded its secrets. The ledger was now with Craddock, but she recalled its entries. Clara's £5,000, marked unpaid. Beatrice's £3,000, with Evelyn's curt demand for repayment, and smaller loans to locals, a testament to Evelyn's influence. Tucked in the drawer's corner, overlooked before, was a folded note in Evelyn's elegant script. Clara, last warning. Settle by month's end or lose all. Miss Marple's lips pursed. The note's ink was fresh, its tone sharper than the ledger's, but something in its placement slipped beneath a blotter felt staged, as if meant to be found. A forger, she knew, could mimic a hand, and the note's discovery would seal Clara's motive. Her mind turned to Beatrice, whose charm and cunning made her a likely architect of such deception. Leaving the study, Miss Marple sought the housekeeper, Mrs. Gibbs, whose harried efficiency hid a wealth of observation. She found her in the dining room, polishing silver with brisk strokes. "Mrs. Gibbs," Miss Marple said, her voice warm. "Mrs. Harrow's study, was it often visited by guests?" Mrs. Gibbs's cloth paused, her eyes meeting Miss Marple's with a flicker of unease. "Not often, miss, but Mrs. Lyle was there sometimes, looking at books," she said. "I saw her once, near the desk, when Mrs. Harrow was out." Miss Marple nodded, her expression thoughtful. Beatrice's presence in the study, like her visit to the kitchen, was a thread of opportunity, weaving her deeper into the crime's fabric. "And the note, did you ever see Mrs. Harrow write one to Mrs. Bates?" Mrs. Gibbs frowned, her memory straining. "Not that I recall, Miss. She kept her letters private, locked in that drawer." Miss Marple thanked her, her mind seizing on Beatrice's access, her potential to plant a forged note. Next, Miss Marple ventured to the grounds, where Tom's shed stood behind a yew hedge, its new padlock gleaming. The tampered old lock, found in a drawer, suggested someone had accessed his cyanide, and Beatrice, with her quick smile, could have charmed her way past Tom's vigilance. Miss Marple pictured her slipping into the shed, perhaps under the guise of admiring his orchids, and taking what she needed. The vials hiding in the cellar, far from the kitchen, was a bold move, distancing it from Clara, but keeping it within reach. Miss Marple recalled the maid Jenny's words, Beatrice near the caddy's shelf, searching for sugar. The pattern was clear. Beatrice's movements, her debts. Her poise pointed to a woman capable of orchestrating a murder and framing another dot to confirm her suspicions. Miss Marple sought the undergardener, Will, whose loose tongue had proven valuable. She found him near the greenhouse, raking leaves with a rhythmic sweep. Will, she said, her tone gentle, you see much in the gardens. Did Mrs. Lyle ever visit Mr. Rigby's shed? Will's rake paused, his freckled face creasing with thought. I miss, once or twice. Said she wanted to see his tools for her own garden, but she didn't stay long. Tom wasn't pleased, said she was nosy. Miss Marple nodded, her expression encouraging. And the shed's lock was, it always secure. Will shrugged, his grin sheepish. Tom forgot to lock it sometimes. Miss old lock was wobbly till he got the new one. Miss Marple thanked him, slipping him a shilling, and moved on, her mind seizing on Beatrice's visit, a moment's access to Tom's cyanide. Back at the manor, Miss Marple sought Craddock, whom she found in the library, his desk buried under reports. His face was haggard, but his eyes lit with respect at her approach. Miss Marple, he said, gesturing to a chair. We've checked the visitor's log, as you suggested. Mrs. Lyle was in the kitchen and studied more than she let on staff. Saw her lingering, always with an excuse. Miss Marple settled into the chair, her knitting bag at her side, and nodded thoughtfully. And the perfume bottle? She asked, her voice soft. Craddock's jaw tightened. Cyanide, as we thought. She's sticking to her story, a mix-up with her cosmetics, but it's flimsy. The vial from the cellar matches the kitchen's. Residue, too. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed, though her expression remained mild. The vial's recovery, the perfume bottle's secretage, tightened the net around Beatrice. Inspector, Miss Marple said gently, might I suggest searching Mrs. Lyle's writing desk? A woman of her finesse might keep mementos, letters perhaps, or a draft of a note. Craddock's eyebrows rose, but he nodded, his respect deepening. You're a marvel, Miss Marple, we'll do it. Anything else? She hesitated, her voice soft. Only that truth is like a thread, Inspector. Pull the right one, and the whole web unravels. Mrs. Bates is a victim of design, I think, not chance. Craddock jotted a note, his expression thoughtful, and left, promising to update her on the search. Miss Marple returned to the morning room. Her knitting resumed, the needles a soft rhythm against the quiet. She pictured the study's note, its fresh ink, its damning words. Beatrice's presence in the study, her access to Evelyn's script, made her a likely forger, planting evidence to seal Clara's guilt. The cyanide's path from Tom's shed to the caddy, hidden in Beatrice's perfume bottle, then to the teapot, was a trail of cunning, exploiting Clara's role and Evelyn's trust. Miss Marple recalled Evelyn's unease, her locked caddy, her glance toward the door at tea. The widow had sensed betrayal, and Beatrice, with her laughter and tears, had woven a trap, using Clara's debt as bait to test her theory. Miss Marple revisited the kitchen, now empty, its air still thick with the scent of herbs. She stood by the caddy's shelf, picturing Beatrice's visit, her quick hands slipping the poisoned leaves into the blend. The key, left on the counter, was a moment's opportunity, and Beatrice's charm could have distracted Clara long enough. To act, Miss Marple's mind turned to the conservatory, where Evelyn's first pour had sealed her fate. The teapot's diluted cyanide suggested a killer who knew her ritual but risked others, drinking her calculated gamble, or a frame to bury Clara deeper. She recalled a St. Mary Mead seamstress, whose forged letter had framed a rival for theft. Beatrice's poise, her debts, her movements each was a stitch in a pattern of guilt. A knock interrupted her thoughts, and Craddock entered, his face alight with urgency. "Miss Marple," he said, closing the door, "you were right again." Mrs. Lyle's desk a draft of that note to Mrs. Bates, in her hand, mimicking Mrs. Harrow's script. And a key, hidden in a trinket box, fits the caddy's lock. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed, though her expression remained mild. The draft, the key irrefutable proof of Beatrice's hand, and her reaction. She asked. Craddock's jaw tightened. "She's rattled, claims the key's a spare, the draft a mistake. But we're bringing her in for questioning." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. Beatrice's denials were crumbling, her facade cracking under the weight of evidence. "Inspector," Miss Marple said softly, "might I suggest checking Mrs. Lyle's correspondence for any mention of cyanide? A woman so careful might have planned her source." Craddock's eyebrows rose, but he nodded, his respect deepening. "You're a step ahead, Miss Marple. We'll look. Anything else?" She hesitated, her voice gentle. "Only that betrayal cuts deepest from those we trust, Inspector. Mrs. Harrow's friend was her undoing." Craddock jotted a note, his expression thoughtful, and left, promising to confront Beatrice with the new evidence. Miss Marple settled back. Her knitting resumed the needles, a soft rhythm against the morning's quiet. The gardens outside shimmered. In the pale light, their beauty a veil for the manor's secrets. The final thread, Beatrice's forged note, her hidden key, her cyanide, was a tapestry of betrayal. Clara's debt, Leonard's greed, Tom's angerage had been a distraction, a prop in Beatrice's performance. Miss Marple recalled Evelyn's strained smile, her locked caddy, her air of unease. The widow had feared a friend, and Beatrice, with her £3,000 debt and desperate charm, had turned trust into poison. The manor's clock chimed, marking the investigation's nearing end. Miss Marple's needles clicked, each stitch a step toward clarity. The final thread was pulled, and the web of murder was unraveling, its heart laid bare in Beatrice's hand. Chapter 12. The truth unraveled. The 9th day at Thornfield Manor broke with a tentative sun, its rays piercing the lingering mist to cast a golden sheen over the estate's manicured lawns and ivy-clad towers. Yet within the manor's grand halls, where polished oak gleamed and ancestral portraits gazed sternly, a palpable tension gripped the air, as if the very walls sensed the investigation's climax. Miss Jane Marple stood in the drawing-room, a stately chamber of damask curtains and mahogany furniture, her lavender shawl draped neatly over her shoulders. Her knitting needles lay idle in her bag, a rare stillness, for her mind was wholly consumed by the intricate tapestry of clues woven over the past week. The cyanide-laced tea, the tampered caddy, the recovered vial, Clara's confession, Leonard's ambitions, Beatrice's facade, Tom's grudge, and the damning note in Beatrice's hand had each brought her closer to the truth. Today she would pull the final thread, revealing the killer who had turned Evelyn Harrow's trusted ritual into a deadly trap. The manor was hushed, its staff moving with the quiet deference of those awaiting judgment. Inspector Craddock had summoned the suspects Clara Bates, Leonard Harrow, Tom Rigby, and Beatrice Lyle to the drawing-room for a final reckoning. his men stationed discreetly at the doors. The conservatory, where Evelyn had collapsed, remained, sealed, its glass walls a silent testament to the fatal tea. Miss Marple had spent the previous evening reviewing her findings. The cyanide in the teapot and her own teacup, the tampered lock on Tom's shed, the vial hidden in the cellar, the perfume bottle in Beatrice's room, and the forged note mimicking Evelyn's script. Each clue pointed to a crime of meticulous cunning, orchestrated to frame Clara while exploiting Evelyn's trust. Miss Marple's instincts, honed by years of unraveling St. Mary Mead's quiet sins, had zeroed in on Beatrice, whose charm and desperation wove a web of betrayal. Now, with Craddock's evidence in hand, she would lay bare the truth. The drawing room was arranged for confrontation, its heavy chairs forming a semicircle before the fireplace, where a low fire crackled, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Clara sat rigid, her broad face pale, her flour-dusted hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes haunted by the weight of suspicion. Leonard lounged with a forced ease, his dark hair slicked back, but his fingers betrayed a restless energy, tapping against his knee. Tom stood near the window, his weathered features set in a stoic mask, his calloused hands still as if braced for a blow. Beatrice, in a muted grey dress that belied her usual vibrancy, sat with a poised grace, her silk handkerchief twisted in her hands, her eyes darting between the others with a mix of defiance and fear. Miss Marple took her place in a corner chair, her frail frame almost invisible, her knitting bag at her side, but her pale blue eyes were sharp, missing nothing, their postures, their glances, the unspoken currents of guilt and dread. Inspector Craddock stood before the group, his navy suit creased from sleepless nights, his clipped moustache framing a face etched with resolve. He held a folder of reports, its pages worn from scrutiny, and his voice was firm, cutting through the room's tension. Mrs. Evelyn Harrow was murdered, he began, his eyes sweeping the semicircle, by cyanide laced in her tea, a deliberate act requiring access and intent. We've gathered evidence treasures in the teapot, a tampered caddy, a hidden vial, a forged note hand. It points to one among you. The suspect shifted, Clara's hands tightening, Leonard's tapping ceasing, Tom's jaw clenching, Beatrice's handkerchief twisting. Miss Marple watched, her expression mild but her mind alert, noting the subtle cracks in their facades. Craddock nodded to Miss Marple, a gesture of deference that drew surprised glances from the others. Miss Marple, he said, his tone respectful, has been invaluable in this case, seeing what we overlooked. She has something to say. All eyes turned to her, and she rose, her frail figure commanding the room with a quiet authority. Her voice was soft, almost gentle, but it carried a weight that stilled the air. Mrs. Harrow's death was no accident, she began, her eyes meeting each suspect's in turn. It was a betrayal, woven into the fabric of her daily ritual. Tea, her trust. The cyanide was in the teapot, mixed with the leaves before brewing, ensuring her first pour was lethal. The caddy, locked and guarded, was tampered with, and the evidence, the vial, the powder, the note was placed to point to Mrs. Bates, but the truth, as it often does, lies beneath the surface. She paused, letting her words settle, her gaze lingering on Clara, whose eyes brimmed with tears. Mrs. Bates, you were desperate, weren't you? A £5,000 debt to Mrs. Harrow, threats to take your cottage, enough to break a stronger heart. You brewed the tea, as always, with her special blend, and you held the caddy's key. The cyanide in your kitchen, the mortar's powder, the vial all pointed to you. Clara gasped, her hands covering her face, a sob escaping. "I didn't do it, miss. I swear I'd never harm her." Miss Marple's expression softened, but her voice remained steady. "I believe you, my dear. Your fear is real, but it's the fear of a woman trapped, not a murderer. The evidence against you was too perfect to deliberate a frame, crafted by a hand far more cunning." Her gaze shifted to Leonard, whose face paled, his charm faltering. "Mr. Harrow, your ambitions were grander shipping venture, a fortune to be made. Mrs. Harrow's wealth was your inheritance, but only if her death was natural. A murder would delay it, perhaps forever. You were in the drawing room before tea, alone, with time to slip into the kitchen or study. Your telegrams to London, urgent and secretive, spoke of debts you couldn't pay." Leonard's jaw tightened, his voice sharp. "I wanted her money, yes, but I didn't kill her. I wasn't near the tea." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes unyielding. "Perhaps not, but your desperation made you a suspect, and a clever killer might have counted on that." She turned to Tom, who stood rigid, his faded green eyes narrowing. "Mr. Rigby, your love for these gardens was your life. Mrs. Harrow planned to sell the East Field, your greenhouse, was a betrayal. Your shed held cyanide, its old lock tampered, the new one a hasty replacement. You were in the shed before tea, alone, with no one to vouch for you." Tom's hands clenched, his voice a low growl. "I'd never hurt her, miss. The gardens were hers, too. She loved them." Miss Marple's expression was gentle but firm. "I believe you cared for her, Mr. Rigby, but your anger was real, and your cyanide was the killer's tool, taken from your shed to weave this web." Finally, her gaze settled on Beatrice, whose poise crumbled, her handkerchief a twisted knot. "Mrs. Lyle," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but piercing, "you were Mrs. Harrow's friend, her confidant, yet you owed her £3,000, a debt you couldn't repay. She demanded payment, threatening ruin, and you smiled through it, your charm a mask. You were seen in the kitchen, near the caddy, and in the study, near her desk. A forged note, mimicking her hand, was found in your desk. A key to the caddy in your trinket box, and a perfume bottle with cyanide residue in your room." Beatrice's face drained of colour, her voice a whisper. "This is nonsense. I loved Evelyn, and I'd never harm her." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed, unyielding. "You loved her, perhaps, but you feared ruin more. You knew her ritual, her first pour. You took cyanide from Mr. Rigby's shed, using the old lock's key, and hid it in your perfume bottle. You slipped into the kitchen, tampered with the caddy's leaves, and planted the vial and note to frame Mrs. Bates. Your alibi playing in the music room was a lie, for no music was heard." Beatrice rose, her grey dress trembling, her voice shrill. "This is absurd. You've no proof." Miss Marple's tone remained calm, her words cutting like a needle through cloth. "The proof is in your actions, Mrs. Lyle. The maid saw you near the caddy, the undergardener saw you at the shed, the note's draft was in your hand, the key in your box. You used Mrs. Harrow's trust, her tea, to end her life and erase your debt. The vial in the cellar was your mistake hidden, but not destroyed." Beatrice's knees buckled and she sank into her chair, her face crumpling as sobs shook her. "I couldn't lose everything," she whispered, her voice breaking. "She wouldn't listen, said I'd be ruined. I didn't mean for anyone else to drink it." Craddock stepped forward, his face grim but resolute. "Mrs. Lyle, you're under arrest for the murder of Evelyn Harrow." He gestured to a constable, who gently took Beatrice's arm, leading her from the room as her sobs echoed. Clara wept. With relief, her hands covering her face, Leonard stared, his charm dissolved into shock. Tom's shoulders sagged, his eyes distant. Miss Marple settled back into her chair, her knitting resumed, the needles clicking softly against the silence. Craddock turned to her, his voice low. "You saw it all, Miss Marple." "How?" She smiled, her expression gentle. "Human nature, Inspector, is the greatest mystery. Mrs. Harrow's trust was her strength, and her killer used it against her. In my village, I've seen it before, charm. Hiding desperation, trust turned to betrayal. The room emptied, the suspects dispersing. Their relief and shock a quiet tide. Miss Marple remained, her knitting a steady rhythm, her thoughts drifting to St. Mary Mead, where simpler lives hid similar sins. Beatrice's facade, her debt, her cunning, had woven a trap, exploiting Clara's vulnerability, Tom's negligence. And Leonard's ambition, the tea, the caddy, the cyanide each, was a prop in her deadly performance. But the truth, as always, lay in the details, a forged note, a hidden key, a misplaced vial. Miss Marple recalled Evelyn's strained glance, her locked caddy, her air of unease. The widow had sensed danger, but not its source, and Beatrice, her closest friend, had struck where trust was deepest, outside. The gardens shimmered in the sunlight, their beauty a contrast to the manor's shadows. Miss Marple's needles clicked, each stitch a testament to her unraveling of the crime. The truth was laid bare, the killer unmasked, but the cost of Alan's life, Clara's fear, the manor's peace was heavy. She rose, her frail frame, moving with quiet grace, and stepped into the hall where Craddock waited. "You've done it again, Miss Marple," he said, his respect unguarded. "The force could use you." She smiled, her eyes twinkling. "I'm just an old woman who notices things, Inspector. Thornfield will heal in time." He nodded, and she walked on, her knitting bag at her side, her mind already turning to the next mystery, for human nature, she knew, was never at rest. The manor's clock chimed, marking the end of the investigation. Miss Marple's needles, now in her hands, resumed their rhythm, a soft echo in the quiet. The truth unraveled, the web of betrayal undone. She left Thornfield to its ghosts, her work complete.